Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the What If guy, back with another fanfiction. This is the third part of What If Issei Became the Ultimate Dragon. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Keysapocalypses asked if there was any way to make him change his mind. Murayama agreed that he could decide otherwise if he wished. Issei reminded them of the primary reason he had been granted an unusual accommodation in the past for medical reasons. Keysapocalypses recalled that the whole kendo club had volunteered to help that day. Knowing the tensions between the students, they had made an extraordinary exception to support him. She still found it hard to believe they had all accepted such an arrangement at the time, especially given how they treated the school's two notorious troublemakers. Hyoudou spoke quietly that his illness was now cured and he no longer needed the accommodation. He explained that it was time to move on, both for himself and for the kendo club. Murayama began to object, but Issei continued, saying the situation could not have lasted indefinitely. He worried it might eventually provoke resentment among the other boys, who would see him as receiving special treatment. A precedent had been set, and it was better to end things now while the mixed classes were still new and male enrollment remained low. If the matter were buried and became a rumor rather than a confirmed fact, it would remain a school legend rather than a justification for ill intent from students who might follow in the future. He also mentioned that continuing the arrangement would complicate things with his romantic relationships. Murayama murmured with a hint of disappointment when she heard he already had a girlfriend, and Issei evaded the comment, saying it was a hypothetical case. He privately felt certain that Réincarner was a partner of sorts after the night he had saved Asia, though the situation remained complicated because Asia was also closely involved. It was difficult to define the relationship clearly with two girls vying for his affection while supporting one another. His fallen-winged companion seemed to leave the choice to him, neither confirming nor denying the arrangement. He was not opposed to the idea of Asia being another partner if that was what she wanted, especially since Réincarner did not appear to object. Returning his full attention to the present, Issei emphasized that it would look bad to continue receiving special treatment involving other girls, especially those who were not among his partners. Keysapocalypses blushed and, in a voice so soft he barely heard it, suggested that if his partner were a member of the kendo club, none of them would be bothered by his continued presence. Startled, Issei asked if she had said anything, and Keysapocalypses hastily denied it while shaking her hands. Issei rose and announced it was time for him to leave so as not to disturb their morning practice. He still had another place to go before classes began. Murayama reassured him that he never bothered them and that he was always welcome to train with the club whenever he wished. Issei promised to consider it, though none of them expected he would take up the invitation, and then he said his goodbyes. Keysapocalypses and Murayama responded in unison and watched him go, hiding their disappointed sighs. The sessions that had brought Issei and the two girls together were the main times they had interacted with him. With those arrangements ended, they worried they might no longer have as many opportunities to talk with him. Both young women liked him a great deal. Besides Hyoudou, he was the only boy they genuinely approved of. For that reason, they thought it would be a waste not to at least maintain a friendship with him, even though neither would be opposed to growing closer someday. Unknown to everyone at the time, Keysapocalypses and Murayama would later each find a note in their locker, accompanied by a pamphlet folded into quarters, that would change their lives for better or worse. For the moment, however, life went on. The two young women returned to their kendo practice while Issei went to the student council office to meet Asia and Réincarner. He arrived after they had finished their meeting but learned, to his great delight, that they would be in the same class as him. For some reason, he felt a shiver of apprehension, as if he should be afraid of something. It was probably just his imagination. The first days with Réincarner and Asia proved far more than merely interesting. They were exhausting. It was not the girls' fault. Their enthusiasm was genuine and pleasant to see. The problem lay with their classmates, both individually and collectively. The girls in class welcomed Asia and Réincarner warmly and helped them integrate as best they could. Many questions, often focused on Issei rather than the newcomers, dominated the conversation and fed the rumor mill. The reputation of Hyoudou remained a topic of fascination among the students at Jusqu'au Academy. Issei did his best to handle the attention without making a scene. The boys reacted predictably. Adolescent jealousy flared, especially among Matsuda and Motohama. For the whole day, Issei found himself at the center of attention and gossip related to the two new students. Rainier had not exactly made things easier. When she introduced herself during the first class, she had been overly candid. Giving her full name and nickname was normal, and mentioning a prior transfer from Italy fit the background story she had prepared. But announcing in front of everyone that she was living with Issei was a bold move intended to provoke a reaction. She had smiled with clear satisfaction when the class reacted, showing she had expected and wanted that effect. Asia, gentle and naive, had been swept into the chaos by Rainier without really understanding what was happening. Having no experience of ordinary school life, she interpreted the class's reaction when they learned she also lived with Issei as normal and simply returned a sweet, angelic smile, confirming Rainier's statement in her own innocent way. It was the truth, even if a Mono-Yuma had tried to play with words to suggest different meanings. To complicate matters further, Rainier had closed the presentation with a deliberately ambiguous remark that stirred rumors. Issei felt uncertain about how Asia understood the situation. He had no clear answer about her perspective. He also had mixed feelings about how to respond to the attention the newcomers brought. This was something he would have to think about later. At present, Issei was heading to the occult research clubroom with Rainier and Asia, as had become the routine. It had been about a week since they enrolled at Kuo Academy and they had begun to settle in, so school life was almost back to normal. Nearly, because some students still watched the trio with dreamy or resentful expressions. Matsuda and Motohama had even tried to badmouth Hyoudou, only to be shut down by a coalition of female clubs kendo, tennis, basketball, track and field which had come to his defense. What made Issei uneasy was that Asia had, of all people, become friendly with Kiryu. That was not a good sign for him. Rainier seemed to approve of this friendship, and Issei felt torn. He worried that Asia, being so innocent, might be influenced in ways he did not like. At the same time, he did not want to push her away. Their friendship mattered. He could not see a clear way to manage it, and the conflict left him unsettled. Sighing, Issei entered the occult research clubroom, followed by the two girls. Rias welcomed them, noting their timing had been perfect and that they could begin. She indicated Akino, who was serving tea, and explained that there was an event that evening she wanted the club to attend. Issei, puzzled, asked whether they had anything planned for the night, trying to recall any prior arrangements. Rias replied that it was more or less planned and then clarified that there was indeed an event taking place that she wanted everyone to participate in. Issei then asked what the event was. Issei leaned in, curious. Rias explained that it was the opening of the familiar forest, a mystical place governed by strange laws. She continued that once a month, at the full moon, the familiar forest, normally inaccessible by physical or magical means, opened unusually. At that time, it was possible to enter and attempt to bind with the familiar. Rainier interrupted and drew everyone's attention by clarifying that the full moon opening applied only to demons. She added that fallen angels like herself could access the familiar forest only on new moon nights. Asia asked innocently about angels. Rainier admitted that she did not know, explaining that she had been born a fallen angel rather than having become one. She had never seen heaven with her own eyes and only knew angels from the stories of those who had been born angels and later fallen. Those tales focused on the Great War and heaven's hierarchy, and details such as access to the familiar forest had never been relevant. The former nun apologized quietly, but Rainier, speaking gently, told her not to be sorry and put a comforting hand on Asia's shoulder. Issei, eager to ease the tension, asked what a familiar was. Rias had brought Asia and Rainier into the occult research club. Asia had become part of the Gremory peerage, and Rainier had been brought in out of respect for the agreement they had reached. Issei was responsible for protecting and watching Rainier, and in return his king allowed her to be enrolled at Kuo Academy. Enrolling her in the club had been a practical way to facilitate their mutual interests. That decision, however, had caused a small complication in the form of Akino. For reasons unknown to Issei, Akino Himejima held an intense hatred for the woman with black wings. The pawn could not imagine why, and he preferred not to find out. The look in Akino's eyes, though, was genuinely frightening. Rainier, for her part, ignored Akino completely and sipped her tea in peace. Rias explained that familiars could be magical creatures, monsters, or almost any kind of supernatural being. She described a familiar as one of the basic requirements for a demon and one of the early steps in their training. Born demons usually bonded with their first familiar in childhood, while reincarnated demons typically formed one as soon as they had gained a little experience, usually after a month or two. Issei repeated the time span with concern and glanced toward Asia. Rias clarified that there was no strict minimum, because the familiar forest was accessible only once a month, and because it took time to learn to use demonic powers. About a month to acquire a first familiar was the norm for a reincarnated demon, and 2 months if someone missed the first full moon. She added that entering the familiar forest early would not harm someone like Asia, who had learned to use magic as a human. Her body adapted more quickly than an ordinary person's. Issei considered this and then asked what the point of having a familiar was. Rias explained several benefits. A familiar could assist its master with tasks such as distributing flyers, gathering information, or delivering messages. In combat, a familiar could support its master with its abilities, which varied by type and species. A good master learned to use familiars to their fullest potential and treated them with respect and kindness. The master-familiar bond also slightly increased the master's power, though its impact diminished as the demon grew stronger. The effect depended on the familiar. A dragon would boost its master far more than a mouse. Rias also noted that familiars could take human form. Issei asked how one obtained a familiar, mentioning the words bonding and contract. Rias reassured him that the process was fairly simple in concept. One had to walk into the familiar forest, find a wild familiar, fight it to weaken it, capture it, and then bind it using an incantation. Sometimes a familiar chose its master without a fight, but more often the familiar had to be defeated in single combat for it to recognize a demon as its master. Rias described it as a matter of mutual respect. For some reason, Issei felt the explanation sounded like a certain video game. Rias added that entering the familiar forest did not guarantee finding a suitable familiar. Sometimes the desired familiar could not be found, and other times the desired familiar was too powerful to defeat. She reassured them that creatures at the forest's edge were relatively peaceful and did not attack travelers without provocation, often letting them flee. However, she cautioned that beginners should avoid venturing too deep, where more aggressive monsters lived, and that using a guide was recommended. She mentioned that she had arranged the best guide for that night. Issei blinked and asked whether it was possible to contract a familiar outside the familiar forest. Rias admitted, with a hint of reluctance, that it was possible but strongly discouraged for beginners and low-class demons. The familiar forest had many innate safety measures that ensured visitors could safely contract familiars, which was not the case elsewhere. It was practically impossible to die in the familiar forest, even facing a monster far more powerful than oneself. One could be seriously wounded, but nothing more. Issei found that danger more than enough and wanted to change the subject. He asked, glancing at each member of Rias's peerage and at Rainier, what kind of familiars they each had. Rias answered cheerfully and proudly presented her familiar as a small bat landed on her hand. Akino modestly produced her familiar through a magic circle and smiled softly as a small oni appeared. Kaneko introduced her familiar as Shiro while holding an adorable white kitten, which suited her perfectly. Yuto indicated his familiar with his usual polite smile as a little bird perched on his finger. Rainier waved her hand and summoned a crow that settled on her shoulder. Issei compared Rainier's familiar to the demons and asked if there was any difference between the familiars of a fallen angel and a demon. Rias replied with a smile, explaining that there was no real difference. The only distinction lay in the binding methods. Demons and fallen angels used different spells that had the same effect, so the results were essentially identical. Her gaze then drifted to the window and she noted that the moon had risen and it was time to leave. Rainier said she would head home. She had no reason to stay there alone. She then offered Issei a playful good luck gesture and smiled mischievously. Asia blushed deeply and, wanting to wish Issei luck as well, quickly returned the gesture in an innocent, awkward way. Akino mused aloud that she might also give Issei a supportive gesture and sent him a playful, lingering look, then smiled thoughtfully. Rainier did not reply but kept smiling, and the look she gave the queen was intense. When their eyes met, Issei felt a jolt of tension between them. Rias seemed to sense it too and quickly intervened. Rias reminded everyone that they really had to go now. Any time lost was less time to spend searching for familiars for Issei and Asia. Issei agreed, eager to end the delicate moment. He hoped Asia would stop pouting at him. He admitted some of the situation was his own fault. Fortunately, Asia's gentle nature kept things from getting worse. After a few more seconds of tension, Rainier finally left the clubroom. The members of Rias's peerage rose and moved to the teleportation circle painted on the floor, where their king was already waiting. Once everyone had stepped inside, Rias activated the circle, which bathed the room in a crimson light before flaring out. The next instant they were gone. Issei Hyoudou admitted cautiously that this place did not look at all like what he had imagined, looking around with suspicion and ready to activate his boosted gear at any moment. He had expected the familiar forest to resemble, well, a forest. He stood in the center of what appeared to be a vast stone corridor. The straight corridor extended as far as he could see in both directions. No matter how he focused his vision, he could not see an end. The only decorative elements were innumerable columns perfectly aligned in 2 rows. When he looked up, there was no ceiling, only a starry night sky. There was no visible moon, which felt strange for a full moon night. The corridor was broad enough for 20 people to walk side by side, and the stars were the only source of light. Perhaps because of his demonic sight, Issei could see as clearly as in daylight. Still, he did not know what to make of his situation. Now that he had time to inspect what he could see, a conclusion formed. He was not in the forest of familiars. The absence of a single tree and the fact that he was alone with no members of Rias's group nearby confirmed that. Strangely, instead of feeling anxious, Issei felt calm, as if the corridor, or whatever lay at its end, radiated a peaceful, almost maternal atmosphere. Issei asked Drake if the dragon had any idea where they might be. Drake replied that he had no idea. The place was totally unknown, seeming both ancient and new, timeless in a way. Issei told Drake to inform him if anything appeared, and Drake acknowledged that he would, though he believed there was no danger. Issei told himself it was better to be cautious. Keeping his guard up, Issei began to move forward cautiously. The apparent lack of danger did not mean there was none. For a moment the pawn regretted that he still lacked the magic to fly. From above he might have gained a view of the area and perhaps an exit. For now, all he could do was walk straight ahead, hoping the corridor would end. He walked for what felt like a long time, perhaps an hour, without any change in the scenery. The corridor seemed unchanging, giving the impression he was not making progress, yet he felt he was moving closer, certain that he would soon reach the end and discover whatever waited there. That thought alone kept him moving without hesitation. After a while, Issei noted that the place gave off a sacred feeling, not in a demon-hostile way, but ancient, important, and respectable. Drake agreed, sharing the curiosity. Eventually, after what felt like another hour of walking, the corridor opened into a wide space. A single glance told Issei that it was a throne hall or something similar. The space was wider than the corridor and no walls were visible, only an endless starry sky. The new chamber seemed circular, defined by the same columns, and everything in the room pointed to something at its center. 2 people stood there. The first, nearer to Issei, was a striking woman in priestly robes whose presence was commanding. Her long dark hair blended with the starlit sky behind her, and her golden eyes were warm and gentle. She smiled with an amused expression. The second person sat on a throne a few steps away. The sight of her eclipsed everything else. Issei felt he could not recall the details of her features. He remembered her kind gaze and benevolent smile, and an overwhelming sense of authority. The priestess stepped forward and welcomed Issei softly. He replied awkwardly, uncertain how to react. The priestess explained that they had summoned him without prior notice because her mistress wished to speak with him. She said they had watched him for many years and had seized the opportunity of his journey to the forest of familiars to bring him here. Issei repeated the name of the mistress, still confused. The priestess revealed that her mistress was Shikigami. Issei's mind failed to process the information. Doragon murmured in disbelief that he could hardly believe it. Because the boosted gear had been part of Hyoudou for so long, Doragon naturally knew the fictitious religion of his host, which suddenly seemed much less fictitious. The woman continued and explained that she was the Sirai serving Shikigami-sama, the high priestess known as the Sirai of Comfort, and that it was an honor to meet Issei and Doragon. The dragon returned the greeting with a slight hesitation. Issei did not answer. He gave a cautious look toward the goddess seated on her throne. She continued to smile but did not speak. The priestess kindly informed them that Shikigami-sama did not speak, and that it seemed Issei was not yet ready to hear from her directly. The priestess added that her mistress had anticipated this and that she would act as intermediary and as the voice of Shikigami-sama until Issei could communicate with the goddess himself. Issei admitted he did not understand how Shikigami-sama could communicate without speaking. The Sirai explained that voice was only one instrument of communication, a shortcut, and that there were many other ways to convey meaning. In Shikigami-sama's case, the goddess had given up her voice from the day of her birth to reach the hearts of her followers more easily. Issei did not pretend to understand, which drew a light laugh from the priestess. She said such details were not relevant right now and would only confuse him, and promised that his questions would answer themselves in time. Because time was short, she invited him to ask whatever he wished now, and then she would explain why her mistress had brought him here. Issei decided to start with the most pressing question. He asked how Shikigami-sama had summoned him in the first place, and why she had chosen this particular day. He suspected it had something to do with the fairy forest. The priestess confirmed his guess with a pleased tone. She explained that Shikigami-sama was powerful but limited. She was not an ordinary goddess belonging to any pantheon in Issei's world, nor to any pantheon in any world. She was one of the rare multidimensional entities. Issei looked puzzled at the unfamiliar term. The priestess tried to simplify. Their world belonged to a specific dimension with its own reality, but other dimensions contained different realities. Closely related dimensions shared many similarities. As one moved farther away from a given dimension, the realities became increasingly different. Groups of related dimensions were called multiverses, and there were countless multiverses across what she called the omniverse. Issei's brow furrowed as he followed the explanation and asked what that had to do with Shikigami-sama. The priestess replied that Shikigami-sama belonged to her own kind of dimension, more like a pocket realm similar to heaven or the underworld, but not tied to any particular multiverse. In that sense she was unique. She could, however, act within almost any dimension of any multiverse if she could establish a sufficiently strong connection to it. If someone displayed immense faith in Shikigami-sama, the goddess could act in that person's dimension even though it was not her own. Issei concluded that because he had been a fervent believer in Shikigami-sama, his faith had allowed her to intervene in his original dimension. He still wondered why she had acted only now, and why she had waited until the moment he was heading to the fairy forest. The priestess explained that because Shikigami-sama was acting in a dimension that was not her own, her powers there were limited and she had to wait for the right moment. The fairy forest existed within a pocket dimension, and Issei had been traveling there by teleportation. Shikigami-sama had slightly altered the destination coordinates so that instead of arriving in the fairy forest, Issei had been transported safely to the goddess's domain. He had still arrived within a pocket dimension, just not the one he had expected. Most importantly, in this place the goddess's powers were at their strongest. Issei guessed correctly that this had been the purpose. He sighed and worried that Rias and the others, who had traveled with him, might be concerned by his absence. The priestess looked toward the goddess with uncertainty, then brightened and informed him that during the brief connection of the teleportation magic to Shikigami-sama's domain, the goddess had used her power to ease the fears of his companions. They would not find his absence strange and would welcome him normally upon his return. Issei asked why she had not teleported everyone here instead of only him. The Sirai answered gently that Shikigami-sama could interact only with her believers. She said the goddess was generous and often favored women when she could, as she embodied comfort and nurturing. However, most of her followers were men, and they were the ones whose faith sustained the goddess. As a result, only those believers could be offered the chance to come here, and so far that privilege had been granted to Issei alone. Issei could only ask why he was special and what made him different. The priestess warned that to answer his question she would first have to ask one in return. She then asked Issei whether he knew how gods are born, clarifying that she meant it from an existential perspective rather than a biological one. In other words, how do they come to exist? The pawn took a few seconds to think, then shook his head and admitted he had no idea. The bosom spirit decided to explain. She said that gods form from human thought and are born into the world independently of any single believer's will. Their powers grow as their followers revere them, which in turn lets them extend their influence further across the world. Gods could be split into two broad categories: those that were always present, like celestial bodies and natural phenomena, and those that rose to godhood from beings close to humanity, spirits that became objects of worship. Shikigami-sama belonged to that second category, though her case was somewhat special. Issei frowned and asked how she was special. The priestess explained that her mistress had been born from a widespread cultural focus on a particular aspect of the human form. She embodied that collective focus, which is why people tended to remember that single feature above all else. It was not that the rest of the goddess was unremarkable, but that her divinity drew attention to her domain rather than to her entire person. Shikigami-sama had not been formed around a single object of worship but from many similar focal points across realities, an unusual reach that made her stand apart from other gods. Issei repeated the idea aloud. She had been born from a universal focus on a particular physical feature, one that existed across realities. He reasoned that normally there should be multiple versions of a god in different realities, each limited by the imagination of their own cultures. Yet Shikigami-sama existed in her own dimension and reality as a single, unique version. He asked why she alone seemed singular across the omniverse. The Sirii praised his deduction and smiled, a reaction that made Issei's heart beat a little faster. Confirmed that Shikigami-sama was indeed the only version of herself throughout the omniverse. Gods were usually tied to the limits of the human imagination and the structured religions that allowed people to conceptualize them within a specific reality. But once one stepped outside their native reality, the unknown loomed large, and humanity instinctively feared and rejected that unknown. Issei started to voice another question but faltered. The priestess understood what he meant. She explained that Shikigami-sama had never been associated with any formal religion. There were other deities whose domains overlapped in some ways, figures from various mythologies associated with love, frtlty, and beauty, but none of them focused narrowly on a single physical aspect in the way Shikigami-sama did. The particular cultural focus that gave her shape had not been codified into worship anywhere until, in one reality, a desperate individual created a religion around that focus. That act, lacking precise boundaries and structure, allowed Shikigami-sama to be born in her own reality and to draw strength from similar sentiments across the multiverse. Issei's brow creased as the realization dawned, and he asked if she was referring to him. The Sirii exclaimed that it was indeed extraordinary. She told him that Hyoudou Issei had sparked the divine ember that became Shikigami-sama and, by extension, her own existence. While he had not done it alone, his prayers combined with a broader, cross-reality current of admiration had made the miracle possible. Issei absorbed the weight of that revelation. It made clearer why the goddess regarded him as special. He had, in a sense, helped give her form. There were countless versions of Hyoudou Issei across his original multiverse and beyond, but apparently none had contributed to Shikigami-sama's birth as he had. His religion, created years earlier, had permitted the meeting that was happening now. It felt like an effect of small causes becoming something much larger. The Sirii reminded him that their time was limited and urged him to ask any remaining questions quickly. Issei asked tentatively whether his role in Shikigami-sama's origin would have any consequences for him. The priestess judged the question complex and said that, for the moment, it would not. Although he was adapting well to his status as a reincarnated demon, He was not yet ready for whatever might come. When he asked ready for what, she could only shrug with a knowing smile and say that her mistress seemed to have plans for him. The spirit admitted that she could not say which ones exactly, but they were certainly important. The goddess Shikigami was very favorable toward him, and not only because of what he had done for her. She had watched him for a long time, since the day of his birth, and had judged him worthy of her favor, the spirit explained. Issei Hyoudou suddenly protested, suspicious. He pointed out that if his prayers had given birth to Shikigami, she could not have observed him since his birth, because he had been born years before he had conceived her religion. The priestess nodded and said the contradiction was understandable within a single reality. She clarified that her mistress was a goddess existing outside the realities of the omniverse, in her own dimension. As such, the goddess's existence stood beyond ordinary time and space, even if in raw power she was weaker than those concepts. This meant that Shikigami was not bound by the usual rules of time or space. Those domains of power became extraordinarily relative when applied to her. Issei rubbed his temple and asked what that meant. The priestess summarized that time had no hold on her mistress, nor did space. The goddess existed outside conventional space-time, or perhaps within her own. Technically, even if Shikigami was born at a given point, she could act and influence nearly any reality at any moment in history, including times before her birth, because of her omniscience so long as there existed sufficient belief or devotion that allowed her to connect. The one true restriction was that she could not interfere with space-time in a way that directly involved her own actions. Issei frowned and asked for clarification. The priestess explained that Shikigami could not go back and undo actions she had already performed. If she intervened in a world at one time, she could not later intervene in that same world at an earlier time and create a paradox by contradicting her earlier action. The primordial laws, ancient as the omniverse itself, abhorred paradoxes. The priestess warned that it was wise to avoid offending those laws, and for that reason Shikigami avoided intervening far into the past, usually following a single present for each dimension of every multiverse in the omniverse. Issei wanted to change the subject to avoid a headache and asked whether it was difficult for Shikigami to act in a given dimension compared with a native deity. The priestess admitted it was different. She explained that Shikigami could not act freely in a given dimension without certain conditions and restrictions, and only in specific situations. That did not mean her powers were weaker than those of a native divinity. On the contrary, the real difficulty lay at the borders between worlds. Issei listened with genuine interest. The priestess described those borders as a pseudo-mystical space called the veil. As its name suggested, the veil literally enclosed and isolated each reality. Each dimension had its own veil, and thanks to it, the reality inside experienced no interaction with those beyond. Issei deduced that the veil hindered Shikigami's ability to act in a dimension unless she was at full strength there. The priestess smiled slightly and said that was part of it, but not the whole story. Beyond the veil there was the void, not a place of time or space, neither physical nor metaphysical, a kind of nothingness that nevertheless existed. The veils were separated from each other by this nothing. Nothing could exist in the void, and anything that entered it would be erased from the reality it came from if it remained too long, even divine powers. The only thing known to resist the void was the veil itself. Issei concluded that Shikigami's powers were first weakened by the void, then by the veil, before penetrating a dimension to act. The priestess confirmed, then hesitated before adding that she had been speaking in generalities common to most realities. Some realities, including Issei's, possessed other protections. In his home multiverse, an overabundance of pocket dimensions created by countless religions and natural phenomena had led to a natural balance in the form of what was called the dimensional gap. Roughly, it functioned like the veil and acted in a way similar to the void, though it was neither. The dimensional gap was often mistaken for one or the other by the very few who even knew alternate realities existed. In Issei's reality, there were likely no more than 10 people who knew about what she had explained, and probably none had details as precise as his. Issei realized that this made him one of the leading experts on multidimensional matters in his own reality, an odd and disconcerting thought. After a long silence, The priestess asked if he had any other questions. Issei answered that he had none. In fact, even if he had more strength left, the pawn was not sure he could handle any more revelations. What he had already learned from this conversation was still a shock. Issei asked, truly curious why Shikigami had summoned him, noting that it was not every day one was called by a goddess, and even less common to be called by one so unconventional. The bust spirit waved a finger in the air and replied that required was too strong a word and that invited would be more accurate. The spirit explained that Issei had no obligation to stay or to listen. The spirit was merely the goddess's voice for the moment because Issei could not yet perceive her directly. The goddess had invited him to offer him a choice, and he was free to refuse or leave. Issei murmured in agreement and tried to rephrase his question, asking again why Shikigami had invited him into her domain. The spirit smiled and told him that the goddess recognized him as her benefactor. The goddess owed her life, her reason for being, and her very existence to him. Without his intervention, the spirit said, the goddess would never have come into being. Shikigami had understood this for a long time and wanted to thank him. Issei protested that it had been nothing more than a desperate call into the void, a multitude of prayers to an imaginary goddess. How could he have guessed it would trigger such a chain reaction? The spirit agreed that he had not known. The spirit explained that all of Issei's past actions had been driven by his desperate need for emotional support, someone to understand his trials and help him through them. Those thoughts, prayers, innocence, fears, misunderstandings, and empty faith had crystallized into the existence of the goddess and the spirit, giving them life and allowing them to appear before him now. Even if dreams had played some part, Issei remained their greatest benefactor. Issei repeated the word dream inwardly, confused, then shook his head and focused on the question at hand. He still could not fully understand why they had sought him out. Compared to them, he said, he felt insignificant. The bust spirit tilted her head and asked whether it was really so strange that they wanted to meet the person who had sparked their birth. Issei admitted that, put that way, it did seem logical. The spirit expressed delight and said that her mistress had waited for this day for nearly her entire existence, fearing it might never come. Without the prior conditions the spirit had explained, the meeting might never have happened. If Issei had remained ignorant of the supernatural, the goddess would have had no way to reach him. Fortunately, the situation had improved, and now that first contact had been made, the goddess would be able to commune with his mind much more easily in the future. Issei said he was happy for them, though he still did not see how it concerned him beyond the fact that he had attracted Shikigami's attention. He asked whether they would see each other again. The goddess asked coquettishly whether Issei was already tired of their presence. Issei responded immediately and sincerely that he was not tired at all and was instead very pleased. He admitted he simply had trouble believing it was real, meeting a goddess was not common, and being told it would be a recurring event felt unbelievable. Shikigami smiled, and the spirit translated, explaining that exceptional situations required exceptional measures. The goddess was not ordinary. She did not originate from this dimension but was bound to it because Issei existed here. Moreover, Issei was literally the only believer in their faith, the one who had created it. How could the goddess remain indifferent? Issei said they did not owe him anything, prompting a soft laugh from the goddess. The spirit clarified that it was not a question of debt, comparing the relationship to that of a parent and child. A child did not owe its parents for being brought into the world. The same principle applied to them. The goddess did not need to repay him, but she wanted to spoil him because she liked who he was, his choices and his personality. The spirit added lightheartedly that the goddess might have a slight crush, which made Shikigami blush. The spirit teased the goddess for betraying herself through her actions and then explained the main reason for the invitation. The goddess wanted to get to know him better, not only because he was her benefactor but because he was a good person and because she liked him. Issei said he thought he understood but remained uncertain. The bust spirit cheerfully insisted that this had been expected from her mistress. After a moment of silence, the spirit formally announced that Shikigami wanted to offer him a gift. Issei was stunned by the word gift. The spirit confirmed that it was indeed a gift and began to explain further. The servant smiled and asked what she could offer that would be useful without imposing, something that would reflect her mistress's feelings without burdening or restricting him. She explained that her mistress had thought long and hard about what would be most appropriate, but she had never quite been able to decide. Issei Hyoudou opened his mouth to reply, then realized he did not know what to say. The spirit brightened and announced that the answer had revealed itself thanks to Issei. She thanked him for having unwittingly made her mistress's task easier. Issei, confused, wondered aloud what he had done. The priestess offered a mild apology and admitted that she sometimes forgot that others did not share her knowledge. She spent so much time beside her mistress, whose knowledge exceeded her own, that she failed to remember such obvious things. She promised it would not happen again. Issei could only respond with a short, uncertain acknowledgement. The servant returned to her explanation. She said that Issei's presence had been the trigger that allowed her mistress to find the ideal gift. When Rias Gremory decided to take him into the familiar forest to look for a familiar, her mistress had used the occasion to bring him to her instead. Because he was here, Issei would miss the current familiar forest session and therefore be unable to obtain a familiar there. However, that absence provided another opportunity. Her mistress could offer him a different gift. Issei lowered his head and absorbed this. The spirit continued, clarifying that her mistress's gift was not a familiar in the usual sense. Rather, Shikigami wanted to offer him a unique way to access a sub-branch of the Pokemon multiverse created with contributions from her mistress. This sub-branch contained a vast variety of potential companions, some of them resembling creatures one might find in video games. Issei, startled, pieced the information together and asked whether Shikigami intended to give him access to that multiverse. The servant confirmed that this was essentially correct. She explained that, due to Shikigami's involvement, the sub-branch had several notable differences from the original multiverse. One obvious change was a population that leaned toward feminine characteristics. Another distinctive change was that the Pokemon there had an alternate human-like form, a form Arceus had playfully named Momon. The servant added that this human form seemed to take some toll on their raw Pokemon power. In that shape they could not access their full strength, operating at roughly 60 to 70% of their usual capability. Nevertheless, they remained formidable fighters and could shift between their Pokemon and human forms without difficulty. Issei stood, stunned by the succession of revelations. The dragon Drake urged him to take a deep breath. Issei followed that advice and felt steadier. The servant went on, unaware of the brief moment of confusion her listener had experienced, and reiterated that despite the reduction in power, these beings were still powerful opponents. An impatient voice then interjected, telling the spirit to stop and let the young man absorb what she had said, noting that he looked close to overwhelmed. Surprised, Issei turned and saw that 5 new people were now present in Shikigami's domain. All were women. The first, standing in front of the others, had a slender, graceful figure and long, pure white hair. Her entrancing gaze was emphasized by ruby-red pupils. A strange golden wheel set with 4 jewels was attached at her lower back. Her outfit was a sleek silver garment with long sleeves, matched by stockings and golden shoes. Her presence commanded respect and authority. Another woman, separated from the rest of the group, was leaning against a column. Her long hair faded from deep black at the roots to dark red at the tips. She wore light armor built for speed and freedom of movement, its colors a blend of carmine, gold, silver, and onyx that masked the lines of her form. Her eyes, with blood-red pupils, carried a mixture of coldness and casual indifference. She radiated an imposing aura, as if waiting for any excuse to act. The third person had an androgynous appearance and was perhaps the most unusual of the group. Her dark pink, almost violet hair reached the middle of her back and seemed to float gently around her despite the still air. Her eyes held emerald green pupils. She wore a loose, Eastern-style robe in a pale purple. Rings of gold adorned her arms and legs, chiming softly with every movement. She gave off a mysterious, ethereal air, as if she were only partially present, and her faint smile reinforced that impression. The fourth woman seemed the most approachable. Her long, silky hair was a bright emerald, tied at the tip with a thin green ribbon. Her outfit was a slightly frilly dress in the same emerald tone, its sleeves decorated with a hexagonal golden pattern that matched the color of her eyes. Compared to the others, her presence was quieter but still noble. She could not be ignored once she was noticed. The last person was essentially a smaller version of the fourth, and together they looked like close kin, most likely mother and daughter. The younger lacked the maturity and experience reflected in the elder's demeanor but had a youthful charm of her own. She appeared the most accessible to Issei among the newcomers. The chest spirit then greeted the group by name in order: Arceus, Giratina, Hoopa, Delta, and Rayquaza. The chest spirit said she was pleased they had arrived in time and that their timing was excellent. Giratina grumbled that they should hurry and finish as quickly as possible, adding that there was someone she found somewhat disagreeable. Her sharp look settled without subtlety on Arceus. The chest spirit promised to be brief and turned her attention to Hyoudou Issei. She explained that the 5 present were Arceus, Giratina, Hoopa, Delta, and Rayquaza, and that they had come at the request of her mistress to give him the opportunity to attempt to acquire a familiar. Issei asked, somewhat bewildered, whether he had to choose his familiar from among those 5. Giratina scoffed. Arceus urged Giratina to be kind, reminding her that the situation was complex and that the young man did not know the circumstances. The Chaos Momon snapped in irritation and insisted they move on and explain quickly. The chest spirit clarified that Issei would not have to choose a potential familiar from those 5. In fact, he would not need to choose at all. A candidate had volunteered in response to the goddess's call to give him a chance to bond. Delta stepped forward and explained that the candidate was her little Ray. Delta said her daughter had recently expressed a desire to see the outside world. Until now she had only known 2 places in their origin realm, the Sky Pillar in Hoenn and the Embedded Tower in Johto. When Shikigami summoned them, Ray had eagerly volunteered. Because Delta was her mother and expected not to see her daughter for some time afterward, she had accompanied Ray. She added that, as a mother, she wanted to be sure the man chosen by Shikigami was worthy of her child. Issei replied with a nervous understanding and glanced uncertainly at the other 3. He then asked about the presence of Arceus, Giratina, and Hoopa. Hoopa spoke next with a voice that sounded both ethereal and mischievous, and the chest spirit nodded in agreement. Hoopa explained that because Shikigami had to expend a great deal of energy to bring Issei into her dimension, the others had to arrive by their own means. Hoopa said that she could deform space-time and cross dimensions, but her power alone was too weak to reach Shikigami's realm. Arceus had used her own power to bolster Hoopa's and made it possible to reach this place far beyond their multiverse. Issei listened and then asked cautiously about Giratina. Arceus replied reluctantly that even combining her power with Hoopa's, reaching Shikigami's dimension was normally beyond their reach. To come here, they had been forced to open a dimensional portal through the distortion world, where fundamental laws are altered and unstable. Arceus explained that Giratina had only agreed to let them use her domain on the condition that they bring her along. He added that it was only because Shikigami had granted access to her realm that they were able to travel so far outside their original dimension. Giratina noted indifferently that Arceus should put more emotion in his tone and that his disgust for her was not strong enough to be convincing to an untrained listener. Arceus chose to ignore the remark and reaffirmed that they were now ready to begin. Hyoudou Issei accepted cautiously, having sensed the tension between the Pokemon goddess and Giratina. The BRZ spirit then invited Rayquaza and Issei to step forward so the battle could begin. Issei repeated the word battle in confusion and then smacked his forehead as he realized what she meant. He chastised himself for not expecting it sooner. In the Pokemon multiverse, everything was settled by combat. Capturing a new Pokemon, training them, earning badges, one had to prove their worth through fighting. A flood of information had left him little time to think of the obvious, which explained why the fight element had escaped him until now. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. Moments later, Issei stood facing Rayquaza at the center of Shikigami's domain, about 10 meters apart. Giratina called to the boy, told him to catch something, and threw an object toward him. As the pawn, Issei caught it midair and examined it. His eyes widened when he recognized a pokeball. Giratina reminded him that he had only one chance and closed her eyes, choosing purposeful silence. Drake expressed immediate disapproval of the object because of its color. Issei asked why, and Drake complained that the top being red should have suited him, but the white bottom made the combination intolerable. He declared that red and white were not meant to coexist. Issei asked if this was something he should know more about, and Drake deferred the discussion, telling him to focus on the objective for the moment. Issei agreed and shifted his attention back to capturing Rayquaza. Rayquaza bowed slightly, introduced herself politely as Rayquaza, daughter of Delta Rayquaza, and said she was pleased to meet him. Issei returned the greeting and introduced himself as Hyoudou Issei. The BRST spirit asked if both fighters were ready. They answered in unison that they were. The spirit explained the rules briefly. The fight would continue until one combatant was rendered unconscious or until Rayquaza was captured. All blows would be allowed, and the goddess would personally prevent any lethal damage. With no questions raised, she signaled for them to begin. Drake activated Dragon Booster, followed by a general boost of energy. Issei declared his promotion to Rook and assumed a combat stance. Rayquaza closed the distance with startling speed. Her fist struck Issei's chest and propelled him through the air with violent force. Issei tasted blood but used his momentum to get back on his feet quickly, only to find Rayquaza already moving again. He managed to raise his arms to block another attack. Rayquaza flowed with the exchange, swept his legs from under him, and a well-placed kick sent him tumbling several meters. Despite the brief exchange, Issei's body trembled. He rose with difficulty, keeping his opponent in sight, and wiped at a small trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. His arms felt numb, and a weary thought told him this would be a long fight. Before he could dwell further, Rayquaza launched another assault. Hoopa observed the match and wondered aloud whether the human seemed weak. Delta agreed, frowning but betraying a hint of pleasure in her eyes. She believed the human did not meet expectations and vowed she would not entrust her daughter to someone so lacking, even if he somehow managed to capture Rayquaza. Arceus cautioned that they should remember he was human and that few could match Delta's daughter in combat without relying on their Pokémon, even among those who had mastered Aura. The BRST spirit pointed out that Issei was still a novice with his power but had shown considerable potential and might yet surprise them as the fight continued. Delta dismissed this possibility, while Giratina remained silent, watching the two combatants with unblinking attention. Issei drew on the boost again, and the servant of the goddess remarked with satisfaction that the real fight was about to begin. Indeed, the match began to shift slightly. Issei was still unable to mount a strong counterattack or evade consistently, but the blows now sent him shorter distances, as if some of the impact were being absorbed. It was not enough to turn the tide, but it was enough to unsettle Rayquaza just a little. For about 3 seconds his attacks became weaker and more hesitant. That was exactly what Hyoudou wanted, to buy time. He had chosen the Rook promotion to gain bonuses to physical attack and defense, and then used his boosts to double that bonus each time. Now, as long as he could hold out, his defense would eventually become high enough that he would no longer have to actively guard to absorb blows, and he would finally have a chance to counterattack. Arceus wondered in a gentle, genuinely curious voice how he became more resilient as time passed. She did not understand Issei's powers because they functioned differently than those in her dimension, and she wondered if he converted damage taken into defensive power. The bust spirit explained that this was not exactly the case. She pointed to the gauntlet on his arm and identified it as the boosted gear, an artifact capable of doubling almost anything its wielder desired. The usual use was to double the user's power, but Issei was far more skilled than most of his predecessors. That was the potential she had mentioned earlier, and she suspected he was currently using it to double his physical defense. Delta snorted with haughty arrogance and insisted that even if his defense doubled he remained overwhelmingly outclassed and would inevitably be forced into defeat. The goddess's servant smiled mysteriously and admitted she would not be so sure. Arceus asked why, still curious. A boost activated. Delta turned her attention back to Hyoudou, surprised. The spirit revealed with undisguised pleasure that she had never said Issei could only double his power once. In fact, Issei could continue doubling his physical defense every 10 seconds. That was the power of the boosted gear. The longer the fight lasted, the less disadvantaged Issei would be, until eventually he could gain the advantage. Delta growled irritably that it did not matter. So far her Ray had used no special abilities, only brute strength, and remained in her Momon form, which was weaker than her Pokemon form. The priestess lost her smile and conceded that it was true. If things continued this way, Issei would have the advantage. However, if Rayquaza chose to get serious, Issei would once again be at a disadvantage and could find himself in an extremely uncomfortable situation. Hoopa asked how that could be, intrigued, but the bust spirit did not answer. Giratina remained silent, continuing to observe the fight. Unaware of the spectators' chatter, Hyoudou found the battle increasingly bearable. He was now almost able to block his opponent's punches with a single arm, though it still required considerable effort. One more boost and he might begin to turn the tide. Unfortunately, with time to think, the pawn realized he did not actually have the means to counterattack. He could endure Rayquaza's blows more easily, but Issei lacked the speed needed to start a true exchange of blows. Only his martial arts training gave him reflexes marginally sufficient to react in time. His boosted gear could double only one aspect or concept every 10 seconds, and it was currently amplifying his Rook trait specialized in physical attack and defense but offering no speed boost. Speed belonged to the knight and, less specifically, the queen. Issei's body still could not withstand the strain the queen would impose. Otherwise he would have chosen that promotion and things would be much simpler. He could, in theory, stack a second promotion on top of the first, but that was not a good idea. Even briefly his soul would not tolerate it. Besides, any useful second promotion would have to be a knight, and Drake had confirmed that this was impossible. A demonic soul, reincarnated or not, could not handle such pressure without being destroyed. Stacking two promotions of the same evil piece type was extremely dangerous but achievable for a very short time. Stacking two different evil piece promotions would be instant death. So in his current state, Issei simply did not have the capability to win by trading blows. If he wanted a chance, he would have to gamble everything on a single opportunity. All or nothing. He had one tool for that: explosion. It would release all the power stored in the boosted gear in a single strike. If he could hit Rayquaza with it, there was a good chance he could capture her. If he missed, his sacred gear would reset and Hyoudou would be in an even more precarious position than at the start. One chance he could not afford to miss it. Another boost activated. The pawn growled mentally that he first absolutely had to find a place to store the Pokeball. With nowhere to put it, Issei had so far been forced to keep the Pokeball in his hand, a huge strategic handicap since he could only use one hand to fight. He needed to fix that immediately. Rayquaza would remain cautious as long as he held it, ready to throw the Pokeball at any moment. He could not simply tuck it into a pocket. The time required to retrieve it would give his opponent an opening, and she was faster than him. Drake suggested storing it inside the boosted gear. Hyoudou admitted with a slight smile that it was an excellent idea. He could gain a small element of surprise. He decided to do it and brought the Pokeball close to his sacred gear. When the two objects touched, the gem on the back of the gauntlet flashed an emerald light. A storage function activated and the Pokeball vanished from everyone's sight. Issei smiled victoriously and seized the momentary surprise of his opponent, grabbing Rayquaza's arm with his right hand to prevent her from retreating. He drove his left fist into Momon's stomach. It was a normal punch. Hyoudou did not use explosion. It was not yet time, since the boosted gear had not accumulated enough power. Ideally 2 or 3 more boosts would be needed to secure a real chance of victory. Even so, the reincarnated demon's strike was far from light. With the Rook trait and 4 boosts, his punch was 32 times stronger than usual. Rayquaza certainly felt it, even if it did no lasting harm and was only a temporary setback. The most important thing was not to release Momon's arm, which would drastically increase the chance to land explosion later. A boost activated and Issei's grip on his opponent's arm tightened. Their close-quarters struggle brought their shoulders almost touching. That was Hyoudou's plan. Lacking the speed to strike Rayquaza outright in normal conditions, he reduced the distance to prevent her from dodging. Suddenly Rayquaza smiled and remarked that she was glad to find him a worthy opponent, admitting she had feared otherwise after the opening of their fight. Issei's persona, the pawn, noted wittily that he was slow to start but had finished warming up. Rayquaza then said she could stop holding back, a declaration that spelled trouble for Issei. Doragon warned his partner to be careful, but it was too late. A sharp pain ripped through Issei's thigh and he sprang back reflexively, releasing his opponent's arm. He groaned, then registered what had happened. His right thigh bore 5 shallow scratches. He looked at Rayquaza's left hand, which glowed faint green. She had clawed him. The pain burned inward in an unusual way, reminiscent of a previous light-based attack but subtly different. A cold realization struck him. His already slim chances had just fallen further. Gritting his teeth, Hyoudou evaded another swipe from Rayquaza, whose glowing hand left an afterimage as it cut through the air. In hindsight, his plan to accumulate more power in the boosted gear might no longer be viable. The priestess, known as the Brst spirit, murmured that this was what she had feared as she watched the battle with growing concern. Arceus frowned and asked what was happening, noting that Rayquaza's attack had only grazed him and wondering why he seemed to suffer so much. The priestess explained plainly that Rayquaza had used Dragon Claw and that Dragon-type attacks were particularly effective against Issei's body. Hoopa wondered whether the boy might actually be a dragon. The priestess considered the question and clarified that Issei was no ordinary human anymore. He had been reincarnated as a demon, which granted him something akin to a darkness type, and the boosted gear also conferred a dragon type. In effect, Issei possessed a dragon dark typing. Delta concluded that Rayquaza's dragon attacks were therefore especially effective. Arceus observed that Issei should also be able to use dragon-type moves, so the balance of the fight might not be too disturbed. The priestess admitted it was more complicated. Issei could use dragon attacks, but their nature differed from those in Arceus's multiverse because the fundamental laws were not the same. In Arceus's multiverse, dragon attacks carry anti-dragon elements that make them effective against other dragons. That principle did not hold in Issei's world. Consequently, Issei was vulnerable to Rayquaza's dragon moves while Rayquaza was not necessarily vulnerable to his, leaving Issei at a disadvantage. Giratina watched the fight with a mysterious light in her eyes. Another boost activated. Issei thought grimly that he could not continue like this without losing. Bitter understanding took root. Even though his physical defense reduced incoming damage, he was accumulating too much harm too quickly. He could no longer simply absorb blows as before. At this rate he would be defeated without being able to act. He had no choice but to use explosion, even if its power would not be optimal. He could not be sure he would last another 10 seconds. Doragon decided that they should go for it and agreed to proceed. Issei accepted with a determined look. He had only one attempt. If he failed, it would be over, but he was certain he would succeed. The jewel of the boosted gear glowed as the sacred gear concentrated its power into a single point, ready to release. Without hesitation, Hyoudou sprinted toward his opponent to deliver a finishing blow. He struck, but his fist was dodged. As long as the strike did not connect, the explosion power would not trigger. Rayquaza had already understood the danger and avoided the attack. Issei tried again, still unsuccessful. It was clear she had read him. There was only one option left. For the first time in the fight, Issei deliberately pulled back and exposed himself to his opponent's offense. Rayquaza did not hesitate, convinced of victory. She rushed forward to strike. Issei had expected it, he had wanted her to commit. With the boosted gear ready, the pawn wounded his arm and punched. The gauntlet met the dragon claw and the world flared green in a violent burst of light. Issei crashed to the ground and tumbled several times before forcing himself up. He could barely stand. His whole body ached and several limbs felt numb. The boosted gear was badly damaged, cracked in multiple places. Only the jewel remained more or less intact. Lifting his head through the dust, he saw Rayquaza standing only a few meters away. Her left arm hung useless at her side, but no other injuries were visible. Rayquaza noted that it had been a good fight, smiling faintly, then made it clear she intended to finish the match. Issei could not accept the word finished. He refused to admit defeat while he still stood and still held a pokeball. He vowed not to concede until he had tried everything. Rayquaza promised a quick end as she closed the distance, intending a single strike to bring blessed unconsciousness. Issei, whispering to himself that it would not happen today, prepared a last gambit. In a fluid motion, a pokeball suddenly appeared in Issei's left hand. He threw it. Rayquaza, now less than a meter away, could not avoid it. A red beam locked her inside and the pokeball sealed. It seemed like the final effort had been too much for the boosted gear, which splintered. That no longer mattered. His final trick had worked. He had succeeded. The victory was short-lived. As the pokeball hit the ground, Rayquaza shattered it from within and freed herself. Issei stood weakened and unarmed at striking distance from an opponent who was no longer kindly. For a moment everything froze as they stared at one another. Rayquaza activated Dragon Booster and closed the distance. Issei was slammed backward, coughing and reeling. His consciousness wavered but he fought to remain aware. Trembling, he tried to rise, but his legs would not respond. He pushed harder, then froze as a pair of feet entered his field of vision only inches from his face. A final impact snapped him backward. He hit the ground and did not move. The boosted gear fell silent and shattered completely as his will slipped. Rayquaza watched her fallen opponent in silence for a few seconds, shook her head, and then turned away, leaving the arena. From the stands, Arceus sighed and noted that the finish had been rather harsh, adding that Rayquaza had not even used her Pokémon form. Delta responded that her Ray would not have used that form unless absolutely necessary. She insisted her Ray was very fair. Delta admitted she had never fully approved of the child taking part, but she had accepted her daughter's choice to try. As Empress of the Skies, Delta Rayquaza could mega-evolve at will and feared no one beneath the heavens. What she feared was the helplessness of watching her child go beyond her reach into a world she could not oversee. Still, since the boy had lost, Delta felt the outcome was acceptable and expected her daughter to return home. Giratina remarked indifferently that it was too soon to celebrate. The chest spirit then intervened, observing that Issei still seemed to have energy left to spare. The chest spirit expressed surprise at the situation. She almost cried out, her gaze immediately fixed on Hyoudou, and the other female spectators followed suit. As the Momon distortion and the goddess's servant had noticed, there was movement from Hyoudou. It was slight and almost imperceptible, but Issei was not completely unconscious. He tapped the ground weakly with his fist. The motion held no power, but it proved he had not yet given up. More importantly, Rayquaza had not noticed. Draig mentally cursed at the pawn and asked whether he was really so weak, whether he would simply give up like this, whether that outcome could satisfy him. Issei answered in his mind that none of that mattered. What mattered was that he would not surrender while he still had even a shred of will. As long as he was not broken and still functional, he would not admit defeat. Draig questioned what he intended to do, reminding him that he had already tried everything and failed. The dragon added that standing up now might not change anything. Issei's anger rekindled his senses. He insisted that it made no difference what he could or could not do. He refused to give up. In response, the boosted gear activated Dragon Booster, and Rayquaza turned with surprise, realizing the fight might not be over. Draig pushed further in the pawn's mind, asking what he would do if there was nothing to be done and no way to win. Issei answered that he would create a way. With renewed determination, he hammered his gauntlet fist into the ground, cracking the surface in dozens of lines. The jewel on the back of his hand shone and pulsed with emerald light. He wiped his face with the back of his other hand and began to rise. Rayquaza admitted that he was stubborn and questioned whether he still believed he could defeat her. Issei's response came with a stubborn pride befitting a pawn. Rayquaza challenged him to show it, and Issei smiled through his injuries before lifting the boosted gear up to eye level. Draig murmured in disbelief, wondering if the gear was glitching. Then the dragon realized it was something else, Issei's will. The boosted gear was reacting and adapting to the strength of his resolve. Draig congratulated his partner and declared that the boosted gear was evolving into a subspecies and that it was nearly finished. He urged Issei to enjoy it. The gear then activated Devil Drive, and the boost command flooded through the pawn. Power surged through Issei like a tidal wave, strong, imposing, overwhelming. He blinked at the extraordinary output flowing from his newly changed boosted gear. The sensation was unexpected but not unpleasant. He smiled and refocused on Rayquaza, who wore a shocked expression. The reincarnated demon's smile widened. He stepped forward and Rayquaza, shaking off her daze, took the initiative and attacked as she had for most of the battle. To Rayquaza's surprise, Issei defended easily and counterattacked. Unlike before, he had both hands available. For the first time in the fight, Hyoudou landed a clean blow without relying on surprise or advantage. The strike forced Rayquaza back several steps and opened a gap that Issei exploited. The Momon readied a reply, her hand glowing with a dangerous green energy as she launched an assault. Issei parried with the boosted gear and drove his fist into Rayquaza, pushing her back and leaving her clearly wounded. Delta stammered in disbelief at how suddenly his strength had increased. Arceus admitted surprise as well, noting that Issei's attack power had more than doubled, perhaps even tripled compared to moments before. Hoopa added that Issei's speed had increased dramatically. What had hampered him in the first half of the fight was no longer an issue. The BRST spirit observed with a radiant smile that Issei had not flinched even after being hit by a dragon claw, suggesting he had become resistant to the dragon-type anti-dragon element. Delta could only whisper that it seemed impossible. Giratina smirked subtly. The Rayquaza matriarch tried to project confidence, reminding others that her Ray still had its Pokémon form to show, but Hoopa doubted she would use it. Transforming would only make her a bigger target, and there was also the question of fair play. Delta clenched his jaw in frustration. Arceus pointed out that with the Pokeball destroyed, the only way for the child to win was to defeat Rayquaza in direct combat. The question became whether Issei could sustain his current state long enough to do so. The boosted gear pulsed again. Rayquaza's situation had grown awkward, mirroring Issei's own early struggles, perhaps even worse because of her injuries. The battle continued, tense and fast, like an intense scene from an action anime, both combatants testing new limits as the crowd watched in stunned silence. Above all, whereas until now they had been roughly equal in strength and speed, she now found herself completely outmatched in every way. However, contrary to what her battered appearance suggested, she was actually quite happy. Her smile made that clear. A fresh blow struck her. Momon had taken so many hits that she had stopped counting, and the attack sent her sprawling to the ground. Hyoudou decided that it was enough violence, though he wore a smile that matched Rayquaza's. Momon informed everyone that she would not stop until she was unconscious, explaining that it was the nature of Pokémon, and that dragons in particular were stubborn and never gave up. That stubbornness was why, even though she wanted to accept the call of Goddess Shikigami and become Issei's companion, she was fighting with everything she had against that very fate. She wanted her future master to be worthy of the title by defeating her, even if that meant risking the chance to explore the world herself. She believed that honest combat was the easiest way for two beings to speak to each other heart to heart. What Rayquaza had seen in Hyoudou's heart pleased her. Whether he could truly make her his remained to be seen. The reincarnated demon admitted with amusement that he understood and was much the same, but he felt the violence was no longer necessary at this stage. Momon began to ask how that would be possible, and the activation of a Pokeball cut the question short. She understood immediately and accepted that outcome. He approved, pleased to hear it. Rayquaza clarified that she would continue to struggle until the end. Issei accepted calmly. Momon issued a defiant wish of good luck, and Hyoudou insisted that luck had nothing to do with it. Their destinies were already linked and it was simply time to formalize it. Since she insisted, he wished them both good luck. On that, he threw the Pokeball. Momon was, for the second time, drawn into a of red light. The Pokeball closed and settled on the ground, wiggling once, twice, 3 times, 4, and then fell still. Rayquaza had ended the struggle. Issei smiled again. He had won. Picking up the Pokeball, he let it be absorbed once more by the boosted gear before he rejoined his spectators, who were deep in animated conversation. Delta reacted angrily, addressing Giratina and insisting that it had been agreed the human would receive only 1 Pokeball. Giratina responded indifferently that she had given him only one and that everyone had seen it. Oppais confirmed that Hyoudou had indeed received a single pokeball and wondered aloud how he could have used two. The bosom spirit, smiling as always, suggested that the boosted gear could double anything, any concept. Perhaps he had doubled the number of pokeballs stored within it, in addition to everything else. Delta grumbled about how overpowered such a power was. Arceus urged Delta to be kind since Issei was present and they would not want him to leave with a bad impression of their final moments together. Delta countered fiercely that she intended to see him often from now on. After all, he was now the master of her daughter, and she would hold him to account if anything happened to Rei. Issei approached, determination in his eyes, and Delta conceded that he at least had some courage, though she still felt he was too weak to protect her daughter effectively. Issei promised that this would change soon. Delta turned away but allowed him to see his daughter and speak with her privately. The priestess of goddess Shikigami congratulated Issei on his victory and assured him that he need not worry about his or Rayquaza's wounds because her mistress had already taken care of them. Issei inspected himself and realized he had indeed been healed. Even his clothing had been repaired. He blinked in surprise and bowed humbly to the goddess in thanks. The priestess explained kindly that her mistress's healing powers were subtle and often went unnoticed unless pointed out. It appeared that Delta had finished her farewells to Rayquaza, and it would soon be time for everyone to depart. Oppais stepped forward, removed a golden ring from his arm, and tossed it where there was nobody. The ring floated above the ground and then widened. Issei stared as the space framed by the ring did not match the space behind it. It was the portal by which the Pokémon had arrived in the domain of goddess Shikigami. After their goodbyes, Arceus was the first to step through the portal, followed quickly by Delta, who made a visible effort not to look back. The bosom spirit announced that it was also time for Issei and Rayquaza to leave. Issei asked playfully if this was a temporary parting, and the priestess smiled and revealed that only her mistress knew the answer. The goddess's servant said she was certain it was a yes between them. The pawn smiled and said that in that case he would see them soon. Rayquaza offered a slightly more formal farewell to Shikigami and the spirit. The goddess's servant softly said she looked forward to seeing Issei again and Rayquaza as well. She snapped her fingers, and the newly formed master and familiar duo vanished without a sound. Arceus, Delta, Issei, and Rayquaza had left. Oppais went next. Only Giratina remained, still in her place and showing no sign of moving. She did not even look at the dimensional portal meant to carry her home. The Giratina in her distortion Mo form leaned against a column, arms folded and eyes closed, as if nothing mattered to her, which might very well have been the case. The chest priestess approached and asked Giratina whether she regretted her choice. Giratina started at the question and asked what the priestess meant. The priestess answered that she knew exactly what was being asked. Giratina decided that there was nothing to regret. The priestess told her that she had a right to happiness like anyone else, and that the chest goddess wished that for her. Giratina fell silent. The priestess asked why she had not expressed a desire earlier and pointed out that Issei had a generous heart. If she had asked him, he would have agreed. Giratina snapped that he was still too weak. The priestess agreed that he was not yet where he needed to be, but she noted that he was improving quickly and soon might meet Giratina's standards. Giratina only answered that time would tell. The priestess sighed and said they both knew the matter was not merely about strength. Giratina growled that she was not the problem, not the anomaly. She recalled how, when the great, perfect Arceus created their world, no mistake was ever made except for her. She described herself as the embodiment of imperfection, proof of chaos within order. All she had wanted was a home, and she had been willing to bear Arceus's hatred for eternity. Instead, she had been exiled to the distortion world, and from then on she had resolved never to open her heart to others for fear of losing even more. The priestess finished the thought for her, saying Giratina had refused to risk losing what little she had left. The priestess said she did not blame Giratina and that, in the same position, she might have done the same. But she reminded Giratina that now there was a chance to start over in a world where she would not be unwanted and where she might even be loved. Giratina sniffed and dismissed such words as meaningless. The priestess disagreed and argued that Giratina's presence here proved she understood, at least somewhere in her heart, the idea of being wanted and loved, however much she denied it. The priestess urged Giratina to give Issei a chance. She might be the person who could free Giratina's heart from its darkness. Reluctantly, Giratina agreed to give him a chance someday, but not yet. She insisted it would only be when he was strong enough to stop her if she were to unleash herself in his world. The priestess accepted this and promised to warn Giratina personally when the time came. Then the priestess urged Giratina to use the dimensional portal before it closed. Giratina looked at the priestess, then nodded after a few seconds. The priestess, pleased, returned to the goddess. Giratina walked toward the portal but paused at its threshold. Hesitant, she looked back toward where the reincarnated demon had vanished and murmured Issei's name. Even speaking his name brought back the memory of the battle she had witnessed. On its own it was nothing extraordinary. She had seen far greater fights and had taken part in some of them, but the boy's actions had been full of a passion she had never known. Something inside her had been kindled by that passion, a flame she could not extinguish despite herself. Even without the priestess's words, she realized she wanted to see more, to understand him, to experience that burning feeling that was unfamiliar and incomprehensible to her. She wanted more, but it was still too soon. With a sigh, Giratina shook her head and finally stepped through the dimensional portal, which then narrowed and vanished. She had no passions, no joy, no hobbies. Those concepts were unknown to her. It did not bother her, nothing really did. The things that could capture her attention were few enough to count on the fingers of one hand, and even then they never distracted her for long. That was the consequence of being immortal and spending an endless life without ever needing to care about anything. After several millennia, trying to find an interest, even a simple pastime, felt almost impossible. Not that she tried. Perhaps the problem had to be understood from another angle to make sense of her mindset. She had spent her entire life, for thousands of years, in the very place where she was born. Her home, her refuge. She had never left. She had never known anything outside it. Logically, the single focus of her whole existence was that place, and the eternal silence that reigned there. And yet, one day, for the first time after thousands of years, she left her home. Why she left she could not say, perhaps she did not even know herself. The fact remained that she went out to see the outside world. She quickly regretted it. Everything outside was so loud. Having known only silence and cherished it, the new sounds simply did not appeal to her. She preferred her silence without question. So after a ridiculously short time, she decided to return home. That could and should have been the end of the story. But during the brief moment she had been away, an intruder had moved into her home. She could have ignored the stranger. Their coexistence would have been possible. A whole dimension provided enough room. However, despite millennia of life, she had never had social interactions. She had always been alone, so the very idea of sharing her home never occurred to her, even though it was likely they would never meet unless one of them sought the other out. Her thoughts were simpler than that. The intruder was a parasite invading her house and her silence. Because she had never truly socialized, her mind had not grown in that way. Even now her heart was pure and naive, her intentions honest. Her intention was straightforward, to make the intruder leave her home. With that resolve, she confronted the invader and commanded them to depart, clear and concise. Perhaps she believed that as the original owner of the place, her wish would be obeyed. What happened instead was beyond anything she could have imagined. The intruder did not refuse violently, they simply ignored her. It felt to her as if she were the parasite, unworthy of notice. Nevertheless, she insisted again and again, thinking she would eventually be able to force the unwelcome guest out. It was in vain. She could have fought. She was more powerful than the intruder, not by much, but enough. She could have prevailed. The problem was that she did not understand what it meant to fight. Her innocence and naivety extended that far. Unable to remove the intruder herself, she reluctantly returned to the outside world. There she believed she would find someone who would help her evict the invader and restore her home and its silence. Since then she traveled the world, anonymous to the masses and a potential threat only to the powerful. She paid it no mind, she did not understand such things. She only wanted to get her home back. Nothing else mattered. Because she had been born of nothingness, that concept shaped her personality. She had almost no emotions, and the few she felt were so rare they might as well not exist. This did not help her socialize, and without socializing emotions did not develop. It was a vicious, endless cycle, ironic in a way since infinity was part of what she represented. Her lack of feeling left her unable to comprehend the emotional logic of other beings, leaving her detached without even realizing it. Over time, traveling had made her accustomed to the noise. It had become tolerable enough for her to blend into crowds without too much discomfort. Yet she longed for the silence of her home. Nowhere on earth had she found a quiet comparable to that refuge. There was always background noise from animals, insects, wind. The world could not provide the absolute silence she sought, and she could not enjoy her home's silence because of the intruder. She still visited her home often, but never long enough to savor its quiet. All of it because of that invader. One day, while searching for someone who would help her reclaim her home, she felt something new, unfamiliar, and mysterious. She frowned, an expression she almost never made. Unconsciously, she lifted her head and looked at the stars. To an outside observer, she might have appeared indifferent most of the time. Not this time. She was thoughtful. Something had crossed her home, the dimensional gap. That was not what made her thoughtful. It was where the thing had come from. Whatever it was had traveled from very far away, entering the dimensional gap from the other end. It had arrived in her home by way of the veil. This meant that it had also crossed the void, a non-place where nothing existed except an absence deeper than absence itself. A nothing so dimensionally superior that even she could not really grasp what it was. She was, in a sense, also a representation of that nothing. And something had crossed it. Whatever it was, it had to be strong, powerful enough perhaps to help her drive the intruder from her domain. Now it was somewhere in this world. With that thought, she decided to begin searching for it. It would probably take days, perhaps weeks, but she would find it. As she left, she did not notice that she, Ophis, the Ouroboros dragon and the infinite dragon god, had genuinely begun to take an interest in something. Rias informed Issei skeptically and somewhat uncertainly that he had a contract that night. It was evening, night was just beginning to fall and the Occult Research Club's activities were starting. Rias and her peerage were gathered in the main room. On a couch, from right to left, Issei and Asia were seated. Rayquaza, in human form, sat on the arm of the couch beside Issei, leaving space for her to sit next to the former nun. She wanted to be beside her master, and that was all that mattered to her. On a side note, as the BRST spirit had said, no one had mentioned the presence or absence of Momon from the familiar's forest. Shikigami's powers had made the matter irrelevant in their minds. It was not hypnosis, probably not, but it was a testament to the goddess's power that her influence worked so effectively across distance and dimensions. Opposite the trio sat Kaneko across from Issei and Yuto across from Asia, each on their own couch on the other side of the low table. Rias sat on the edge of her desk with her arms crossed, while Akino stood beside her, the picture of the refined woman she liked to appear as. Rainier was also present, leaning against a wall behind the pawn, as far from the rest of the peerage as possible. Whether out of respect or disdain was difficult to tell. She was calm, which alone suggested she meant no immediate harm. Issei noticed that his king seemed different, less confident and assured than usual, and asked if something was wrong. The Gremmery dismissed his concern with a small smile, and said she was just thinking. She held a document and admitted she did not understand something about his contract that night. She indicated the paper and explained that this contract was, to put it mildly, atypical. Issei replied that contracts were usually unusual for him anyway and thought of his two main summoners, Miltan and Morisosen. Miltan could hardly be called an ordinary person, a bodybuilder who dreamed of being a magical girl, a woman in a man's body. She had initially been Yudo's client but had chosen to keep the Hyoudou as her primary contracted demon. Despite appearances, she was gentle and kind, and Issei had come to accept her as a young woman exploring her identity. The second summoner had been an otaku with particular tastes. That detail would not be expanded. The man had become Issei's principal contracting summoner by a strange twist of fate and was fascinated by the sacred gear, developing many theories to understand it. His interest had benefited Issei, who could already imagine the man's delight at any sudden evolution of the artifact. In short, the nature of Issei's contracts tended to be peculiar. They often felt less like burdensome tasks and more like pleasant activities, watching magical girl anime, discussing theories and possibilities for the sacred gear, more of a hobby than work. A modern demon contract was not so different from an employment agreement between an employee and an employer, largely routine with some differences in detail. Rias nodded and agreed, but reiterated that this particular contract was even more unusual than usual. For one thing, it was not a simple contract but a double contract. Issei looked confused and asked what that meant. Rias explained that a double contract, as the name suggested, was actually two distinct contracts, each with its own summoner. On the surface, that was like having two separate contracts, but the key difference was that a double contract had both contracts carried out simultaneously and in the same place. Rias elaborated that while a demon's power increased slightly with each completed contract, the gain from two separate contracts would normally be the sum of their individual boosts. In a double contract, however, the two summoners invoked the demon at the same time in the same place, causing the contracts to resonate with one another. Rias explained that the effect was to add the values of the contracts together. Each contract's value doubled and, because there were two, the demon received that amount when the contract was fulfilled. The result was a profit 4 times the original amount, twice as much as two separate contracts. Issei admitted that it was practical, unable to find a better word because of his amazement. He asked what would happen if there were more contracts. Rias explained that with 3 contracts it became a triple contract. The profit was 9 times the initial amount, 3 times more than 3 separate contracts. With 4 contracts it became a quadruple contract, yielding 16 times the original amount, 4 times more than 4 separate contracts. She smiled as she pointed out that the values of these types of contracts increased exponentially with the number of contracts within the set. The pawn repeated the word exponentially to himself and glanced at his left hand, an idea beginning to form in his mind. Rias then stated that such contract types were extremely difficult to obtain. Double contracts were already rare, and the rarity increased as the number of combined contracts grew. It was not possible to force the creation of a double contract or higher. The phenomenon depended on certain circumstances and conditions that were practically impossible to reproduce, mainly because not all of them were even known. Issei murmured that he understood, not feeling particularly concerned. Rias shook off a stray lock of hair and said that the rarity was not the reason she had called his contract atypical. Double contracts did happen. Hyoudou and Kaneko had each had one at some point, and Akino had completed 2, but what puzzled her was that Issei's contract came from a new contractor. Rias admitted that she herself had never received one, largely because her contracts tended to be of a higher rank than his or those of the rest of the peerage, and higher rank contracts were less likely to be double contracts. Returning to the point, she emphasized that it was the source of the contract that left her confused. Issei confessed that he did not fully understand the problem. Rias sighed and looked again at the document in her hand. She reminded him of what she had told him the day he went out on his first contract. There were 2 ways to obtain a contract. One was by accepting a general request addressed to the Gremory family without specification. The other was by receiving a contract from a member of one's own peerage. The first method remained consistent. The second meant that once a demon developed a base of invokers, they would regularly receive contracts from those people. Rias explained that this contract came from a new contractor, a person who was not part of Issei's base of invokers. In that case, the contractor should not have been able to summon him specifically for a first contract. The request should have been a general one for the Gremory family. Instead, the contract was addressed to him personally and it was a double contract. Rias asked if he was starting to see why she was surprised. Issei said that he did, and began thinking of an explanation. He suggested that perhaps the 2 contractors were summoning him personally because they already knew him, which would imply they already knew he was a demon. Rias agreed that this was possible. She added that it was also possible, though less likely, that the two invokers had made a general request to the family while talking about him at that moment, which might have made the contract nominative by chance. She found that scenario unlikely, but theoretically possible. Issei hesitated and asked what he should do next. He wondered whether he should answer the summons or ignore it, and whether it might be a trap. Rias took a moment to think and then said that, although a trap could not be completely ruled out, it seemed improbable. Double contracts were rare and almost impossible to fabricate, so it was reasonable to assume there was nothing to fear. She reminded him that he was her pawn now and thus a member of the Gremory family. As a family member, his actions would affect their reputation, and they could not ignore the request of a contractor, especially one that specifically summoned a particular demon. It was a matter of honor. Issei decided that he would go. The thought of Rias's concern for them made him smile. Rias confirmed that decision, though she knew it was unnecessary. She noted that he had no other contract requests that day, so he could take his time and make a good first impression. If the two new contractors were satisfied with his performance, they might become regular invokers for him. With some luck, he might even receive more double contracts from them in the future. Issei agreed, though he remained cautiously realistic. It was not uncommon for some contractors to summon a demon only once out of curiosity, and regular invokers were a small minority. Rias decided that once he had handled the summons, he could accompany Asia to continue distributing her flyers. Despite having her own familiar, a sprite dragon named Rasse, the ex-nun still planned to hand out her flyers manually for a few days to get a better sense of Kuro. Hyoudou said that it was only natural, as if it were self-evident, which, in a sense, it was. For him, anyway was. This particular point was something Hyoudou had refused to negotiate or compromise on. The ex-nun was so naive about the outside world that, even though she had been reincarnated as a demon, it was better not to let her wander the town alone. If she met an unscrupulous person, he could easily persuade her to follow and assist him under false pretenses. She could be led into danger without realizing it. Rainer was unavailable. If even he could not do it, Aquino had volunteered to take charge of Argento and teach common sense and proper conduct. That was not necessarily good news. The idea of Aquino as his instructor was worrying. Who knew what ideas she might plant in his head? In many respects, she was no better than Rainer in the influence she could have over Asia. Fortunately, a responsible arrangement was put in place to keep things on track. She had never actually had to look after Asia Argento herself. Issei had, up to that point, always managed to find free time for the former nun. When he had contracts, unless he could not avoid it, he arranged for the former nun to begin distributing flyers only after he had finished his own work so he could accompany her. It had been 10 days since Asia had been reincarnated and started handing out flyers, and so far the system was working well. It helped that he did not have many contracts and that the former nun had not yet begun to be summoned. But when that moment came, Issei would really have to think of a plan. It was difficult, almost impossible, to know what kind of summoner she might encounter. He could temporarily take on contracts from other members of Rias's peerage, but that would only be a stopgap. Sooner or later she would need to establish her own regular summoners. Issei refused to let just anyone get close to Asia without first knowing the purity of their intentions. Asia thanked him and addressed him as Issei. A curious detail about the young woman was that she alternated between Issei-san and Issei-san when speaking to him. She seemed unsure which form to use despite being told that both were acceptable. Issei replied with a gentle smile that he was responsible for her and for her happiness, and that it was his duty to ensure she was happy, healthy, and well integrated. His words reassured her. Her remark made Argento blush slightly. Rias suddenly interrupted, clapping her hands and announcing that it was almost time for Issei's contract and that he should get going so he would not be late representing them to a new summoner. Issei Hyoudou, the pawn, confirmed he would leave immediately, nodding. For a demon, being unable to teleport was a real handicap, especially when visiting summoners' homes. Cases like Issei's, with a ridiculously low amount of magical energy, were rare. In any case, over time the problem would resolve itself. All Issei had to do was complete enough contracts and, sooner or later, he would strengthen his demonic power enough to teleport on his own. Until then he would make do with the bicycle, which did not bother him much. Still, he admitted it was a little irritating to be regarded as weaker than a child in terms of magic. Sighing, Issei retrieved his bike and pedaled toward his new summoners. He honestly did not know what to think. His clients so far had been occasional summoners. The two exceptions were Morisawa and Miltan, who were part of Kaneko and Hyoudo's regular summoner base. Outside of them, he had never really established a steady client list. Now suddenly he had a double contract from strangers who had requested him specifically. Issei understood Rias's suspicion. He felt wary too. As Rias had said, the fact that it was a double contract made it unlikely to be a malicious summoner. Otherwise the pawn would have suspected Fried's interference or one of his associates, since Fried had not yet resurfaced. Beyond suspicion, Issei was curious. If the two summoners did not mean him harm, what did they want? He could not imagine a credible scenario. Unable to anticipate the upcoming meeting, he continued on and arrived at his destination about 15 minutes later. Looking around quickly, the pawn noted it was an upscale neighborhood, similar to where his family lived. He had never taken contracts here and did not know anyone. Taking a breath, the reincarnated demon approached the house and knocked 3 short times. Silence was his only answer, and for a moment he feared the worst, that this might repeat his last contract where he had the unfortunate encounter with Fried Zelzen. Furrowing his brow, he prepared to summon the boosted gear and to knock again, just in case. Before he could act, he heard footsteps approaching. In fact, there were 2 people, his hearing told him. An unfamiliar voice asked who was there. A familiar female voice called from the other side of the door. Issei responded in disbelief, asking if it was Murayama. A second equally familiar voice answered by calling his name. Issei asked if it was Keytace, more surprised than before. The first girl then cried out with obvious joy, expressing that it really was him and asking what he was doing there. She sounded happy but a little puzzled. Issei, scratching his head awkwardly, reminded them that they had called him. Murayama answered honestly that they had not called anyone. Keytace confirmed that they had been busy and had even turned off their phones to avoid being disturbed. Issei looked from one girl to the other with uncertainty as the situation grew more confusing. Suddenly he produced one of the flyers he always carried and held it up, asking if it looked familiar. Both kendo teammates gasped in recognition, and Murayama, her eyes taking on a panicked look, asked why he had it. Issei repeated that they had called him and waved the flyer slightly. Keytace was the first to understand what that implied and stammered, asking if he really meant that he was a demon. Issei was surprised that they did not already know and then asked how they had managed to call him if they were unaware of his nature. To Issei's surprise, the 2 girls glanced at each other, blushed violently, and averted their eyes, clearly embarrassed. After an awkward silence, Keytace finally admitted, with a stutter, that they had not really called him. She explained that the flyer had promised to grant wishes, and they had been tempted. Issei pressed gently for clarification, and Keytace faltered, unwilling to finish her thought. After a moment, Issei realized what she meant. The 2 kendo members still refused to meet his gaze, mortified and ashamed. Issei asked uncertainly if their wish had been for him. Murayama quickly denied that outright and then, with timid honesty, said that they had wanted help finding excuses to keep talking to him, some simple advice, nothing more. Keytace added, slightly encouraged by her friend, that they were not very good at talking with boys. She explained that Jusqu'au Academy had once been an all-girls school, so they had had few interactions with boys. Dealing with perverts was one thing, but having an ordinary conversation with a boy was a different kind of problem. Murayama continued, with tears welling in her eyes, saying that Issei's interest in kendo had made it easy to talk to him because they shared a topic. But after he had told them he would stop visiting the kendo club, they had lost any excuse to continue conversations. Keytace blurted that he had been the only boy they were interested in. She compared him to Kiba, who was kind and polite but distant, someone they respected but did not feel close to, unlike Issei. Murayama confessed that they simply wanted to keep speaking with him but did not know how. She admitted that, apart from wielding a bamboo sword, They felt ordinary average grades, ordinary lives, and wondered how they could attract the attention of someone now standing alongside Rias, Aquino, and even Kaneko. Issei had no immediate reply. Joining the occult research club had indeed raised his standing to the same level as those girls, something he never expected would have such consequences. Kate murmured that what they had done was wrong, tears finally falling, but begged him not to hate them, the plea almost a cry. Overwhelmed and unsure how to respond, he had never been in this kind of situation. Issei acted on impulse. He reached out, took each girl by the shoulder, and drew them into a comforting embrace, holding one in each arm. Marayama and Kate tensed for an instant, then relaxed and began to cry openly, their faces hidden on his shoulders. Issei soothed them in a gentle, reassuring tone and stroked their hair with his hands. It was more physical contact than he had ever had with a girl before, given in a moment of simple comfort and consolation. Issei reassured them that everything was fine, that he was not angry, and that there was no reason to cry. It took another 10 minutes for the two girls to calm down completely. In hindsight, it was not surprising. In their panic and desperate wish for resolution, they had confessed their feelings for Issei. Once they accepted that fact, Kate and Marayama stopped crying and reluctantly let go of the pawn. Their faces were still a little flushed and their eyes a bit red, but they seemed calmer, if somewhat shy. Kate, the girl with pink hair, asked in a small voice if Issei really was not upset with them. Issei assured her that he was not. He explained that the flyers were meant for this kind of situation. They fulfilled requests, including matters of the heart and guidance. At that remark, both girls blushed even more. Issei noted that in the end it had worked. After all, he was there, and that made them smile shyly. He had never seen them like this before and had to admit that they looked very sweet. At the same time, Issei understood what had happened with the flyers. It seemed that Marayama and Kate had used them to call a demon, or more likely, two demons, to help with their problem. Despite their confidence in kendo, they were timid at heart. Their true wish had not been simply to talk to Issei. Their desire had been more complicated, driven by a mixture of feelings that crossed the line from pure friendship. That selfishness, combined with the fact that the flyer they used belonged to the Gremory family of which Issei was now a part, led the contract to interpret that Issei had been specifically requested. Issei then wondered aloud how they had ended up performing a joint summoning. He pointed at both of them and asked that question directly. Marayama and Kate exchanged embarrassed looks and explained that it had come about naturally. Marayama said they were childhood friends who had grown up together and had once made a promise to each other not to be separated. If a boy ever attracted both of them, they had promised to handle the situation together rather than let either of them be made unhappy. Issei murmured that it was adorable. The explanation made sense. A sincere, though somewhat selfish, wish reinforced by their shared resolve likely satisfied the conditions for a dual contract. Kate tried to say they knew it was strange, but Issei interrupted to insist that it was not strange at all. He told them that situations like this were more common than they might think, thinking in part of past incidents he had seen. Kate nodded obediently but still appeared skeptical. In the ordinary human world, such a situation would seem unlikely, but in the supernatural realm things worked differently. Whether they liked it or not, they had now brushed up against the border between the two worlds. A quiet settled over them. The girls remained hesitant to speak while Issei considered the improbable events of the past minutes. He believed they had been sincere, but something about the situation felt off. He realized he had never distributed flyers in that neighborhood, and Asia had not either, since whenever she handed out flyers she was with him and they tended to operate in the same areas. He was also fairly certain that others like Hyoudou, Kaneko, Aquino, and even Rias would have followed similar patterns. If no one from their circle had delivered flyers there, how did Marayama and Kate come into possession of not one but two contracts? It should not have been possible. He thought back to the start of the day, when the girls had said they found the flyers shortly after he told them he would no longer attend the kendo club. That was also the day he had lost a few of the flyers he kept in his pockets. That could explain their origin, except that Issei rarely lost anything. He prided himself on being conscientious. That part of the mystery remained unresolved. Issei then steered the conversation back to the original. reason for his presence, and asked what they wanted him to do now that they had called him. He reminded them that his appearance only activated the contract. He still needed a mission to fulfill it. Keysapocalypses, who seemed the braver of the two despite still being shaken, asked what exactly he could do. Issei considered and said he could probably do a lot of things, but the simplest approach was for them to ask for something specific and he would tell them whether he could accomplish it. Murayama stammered, asking timidly what would happen if he could not fulfill their request. Issei explained that if he could not perform the requested task, the contract would become void. He reflected on the example of a previous failed contract and how that had been handled. Although he had been unable to grant the exact power another had sought, the experience had still helped that person in other ways and had led to them becoming a regular summoner. There was a brief pause as they considered their options and the weight of what had transpired. A short, neutral moment passed before they prepared to make their request and move forward. Yui was kind and had a big heart for anyone brave enough to look beyond appearances. Yui Keysapocalypses shouted no a bit too abruptly. She realized it immediately and flushed, this time from embarrassment and a touch of shame. She stammered that if the contract was void he would have no reason to stay and that she would find an easy mission. Then she frantically scanned the room for any idea. Hyoudou soothed Yui gently, reminding her that he had said earlier he was theirs for the evening and that she and Ritsu Murayama should take their time deciding. He added that he was not going anywhere for the next few hours, so there was no rush. Yui insisted that he call her Yui, her determined look contrasting with the shyness she had shown before. Issei looked surprised. Yui repeated that he always used her family name and that it felt impersonal. She wanted to be called by her given name. Issei agreed and used her given name, which made Yui shiver slightly. She appeared unusually happy, perhaps more than the situation warranted. Ritsu Murayama gathered her courage and asked him to call her by her given name as well. Issei complied and called her Ritsu. He found their reactions endearing. Both girls were blushing under his gaze. Ritsu asked eagerly if that would be enough to count as the contract mission. Issei considered and replied that being called by their names might fulfill part of the mission but not the entire task. He trailed off when he noticed Ritsu rubbing her shoulder. Issei asked if there was a problem with her shoulder. Ritsu downplayed it, saying only that she had some soreness from recent kendo training. Issei offered to massage her shoulders, hoping to be helpful. Yui asked in surprise whether he could do that. Issei admitted he had never done it before but knew the basics and was willing to try. The two girls exchanged a glance and then smiled, and Issei felt an odd, not unpleasant sensation at the sight. Yui suggested in a sing-song tone that they might have found his mission for the evening. They had just finished a restorative massage session performed by Issei. Issei had focused on pressure points, a technique he knew from his training in various martial arts. Despite his initial skepticism, he found the women's praise believable. Both girls had visibly relaxed under his hands after an hour each. Keysapocalypses had been the first and still had not moved much since her session ended. Whether that was genuine exhaustion or simple laziness remained unclear. One detail he had noted was that once a session began, the girl being massaged stopped stuttering. After 2 hours, Yui showed no sign of relapse, while Ritsu was still in the middle of her own treatment. Perhaps they had simply grown accustomed to his presence. In any case, the contract had been a success. The summoners were more than satisfied and Issei had completed his duties without serious trouble. The small issues at his arrival were to be expected for a first contract. It was his role to guide them through the process, which he had done. He allowed himself to appreciate the smooth outcome and the relief it brought. Issei announced with a reluctant tone that the session was over for today. Ritsu responded with a disappointed pout and said she could have continued for hours, and Yui nodded enthusiastically in agreement. Issei smiled and observed that all good things must come to an end, which was part of their appeal. Keysapocalypses admitted she did not think she would ever tire of it, sitting up with a still dreamy expression. The summoned pawn shrugged to hide his amusement. Both kendokas sighed in contentment. Ritsu then asked shyly whether they would have another chance to summon him. Issei assured them that they would, asking why they would doubt it. Yui spoke more quietly, explaining how unreal it all felt, that demons existed, that Issei was a demon, and even that Rias, Aquino, and acquaintances like Kaneko and Kibo were involved. The girls had pieced things together on their own. They had noticed his sudden recovery and his joining of the occult research club around the same time. If Issei had become a demon, it followed to them that others might be as well. They were mostly correct, aside from a few exceptions. Issei confirmed gently that it was real. He told them they would receive new flyers in a few days so they could summon him again if they wished, and that they would be able to do so at either girl's house. Ritsu expressed concern about not receiving more flyers. Issei paused to consider. Logically they should have received one already, but they had not. He had used a desire sensor to confirm that both girls still had the intent to summon him. Perhaps Rias would have an explanation. Then Issei said he had a preventive measure and produced several folded flyers from his pocket. He handed them out so the girls could continue summoning him until their own flyers arrived, and promised to provide more if necessary. Yui thanked him, nearly moving to embrace him but stopping herself. Issei said it was time for him to go, but reminded them that they still needed to complete the formalities of the contract. He prepared to conclude the agreement and receive the agreed payment. Issei Hyoudou asked if he could try something, requesting permission from the girls. Yui accepted, appearing determined to act as the duo's spokeswoman and clearly intrigued. Issei thanked them and warned them to watch their eyes as he raised his left arm. A green beam of light announced the appearance of the boosted gear on his arm, momentarily dazzling both girls despite the warning. When their vision cleared, they observed with confusion and interest the red gauntlet now covering Hyoudou's hand. Yui Kates, showing courage, stepped forward and touched the artifact with her fingertips, visibly awed and wondering what it could be. Issei declined to explain fully and promised they would discuss it next time, implying there would be another summoning, and reminded them that he was, after all, a demon. Issei then inspected his arm and murmured that it should be fine, squinting slightly. Yui asked what he had done, and Issei, amused in his role as a pawn, offered no direct answer. Ritsu unexpectedly completed the payment to the reincarnated demon, and when their hands met, Issei had to hide a victorious smile. The test had worked and the results were clear, a development that would help him as a demon, but his first priority was to deliver the reward to his king. Issei announced that he would be leaving for now and said he would see them tomorrow. Yui and Ritsu responded in unison that they would see him tomorrow. Rias Gremory smiled and observed that Issei had returned, asking how his contract had gone. Issei began in a dejected tone but then declared with a mischievous smile that it had been a success. Rias expressed her happiness for him, her smile widening as she noted that a double contract was a rare opportunity at this stage of a demon's growth and not to be missed. Issei returned her smile and produced the payment for the contract as he stepped forward. Only when he drew close did Rias, as his king, notice something different about her pawn. She asked about his magical power, clearly shocked. Issei admitted that she had noticed and, amused, explained that his magical power had indeed increased. He agreed with her that the double contract had been very beneficial. Rias shook her head in disbelief and emphasized that this was more than a mere benefit. Such magical growth from a contract, even a double contract, was unprecedented. She demanded to know what had happened. Issei replied with pride that he had used the boosted gear on the contract. Rias reacted with even greater shock. Issei summarized for her that when she had explained that a double contract worked by the resonance of two contracts and that their power grew exponentially, he had seen a connection with how the boosted gear operated. He had decided to apply the boosted gear's power to the contract to see what would happen, and the result was obvious. From what the reincarnated Issei had understood, magical energy could be quantified in points, and the smallest amount commonly seen was the energy gained by completing a contract. Completing a low-class devil contract normally increased magical energy by 1 point, sometimes 2 depending on difficulty. After many discussions with Rias and Aquino, Issei had been able to go further. He had determined that an average demon child possessed about 500 to 800 points of magical energy. Rias's value was closer to 15,000 points, and Aquino Himejima was a bit higher at around 18,000 points thanks to her queen piece. Issei did not know Asia's exact number, but for comparison, he had barely 10 points of magical energy after his reincarnation. He also knew that using a teleportation magic circle cost about 70 points of magical energy. However, by applying the boosted gear to the contract, Issei had multiplied the energy gain dramatically, a 16-fold multiplier. The double contract added another quadrupling of that gain, bringing the total multiplier to 64. In other words, in a single contract he had gained as much magical energy as if he had successfully completed 64 ordinary contracts. That explained the explosive magical growth and Rias's shock. Thanks to this increase, Issei could now even use teleportation magic, since he had more than 50 points of magic within him. This alone made the research effort worthwhile, and he felt proud of the results. At this rate he could quickly close the gap between himself and the rest of his king's peers in raw magical power. For other aspects, he believed effort could overcome them in time. Rias warned him not to be overconfident and reminded him that even if his method was ingenious, using the boosted gear made the increase potentially temporary. Issei answered that this was precisely what he was proud of. He had not directly boosted his power, but the gain provided by the contract itself. Once the boost on the contract ended, the gain had already been assimilated into him and thus became independent of the contract. In other words, he claimed the increase was permanent. To demonstrate, he showed his arm without the boosted gear active as proof that the sacred gear's effects were not currently engaged. Rias asked if he was sure, her voice careful and her expression slightly calculating. Issei frowned at the subtle, almost desperate hope he detected in her. He reassured her that he was reasonably confident but admitted it had been only a first test. Unknown variables could have interfered with the result, and the boosted gain might fade gradually over several days instead of disappearing all at once. He preferred not to give a definitive answer yet, just in case. Rias fell silent and, thoughtful, asked him to be careful because she did not want him to hurt himself experimenting. Issei promised to be careful, and he intended to keep that promise. He had taken precautions even for this experiment. Absorbing that amount of magical power might be trivial for an ordinary demon, but not for him. Issei had had less than 20 points before the double contract and now had more than 80, effectively quadrupling his total magical energy. The change was enormous, and he had not been sure his body could handle it. Unlike a boost or a bishop promotion which could be cancelled if the pressure became too great, this method was permanent. For that reason, in addition to multiplying the contract's energy gain, Issei had used 4 boosts on his body's capacity to adapt to the new magical load, multiplying that capacity by 16. Even so, he still felt a faint, very slight discomfort from the sudden increase, even after half an hour. Fortunately, he had not used his boosted gear at full power on the contract. Otherwise, the results could have been disastrous. There was also the fact that the boosted gear had become a subspecies and its new form was not yet fully stabilized, which made any experiment with the sacred gear even more delicate. Issei had always been cautious, sometimes to the point of paranoia, and that care had once again proven useful. One wrong move could be irrevocably damaging. Looking at his left hand, Hyoudou Issei clenched his fist with determined eyes. He resolved to be careful. Rayquaza lay flat on Issei's bed, kicking her feet idly, and complained that she was bored. Issei sighed that there was nothing he could do, not even bothering to look at her because he was too used to her antics. The Momon then suggested that he take her with him. The pawn immediately refused, explaining that his client's contracts were meant to be handled privately and that having a spectator would be inappropriate, especially if the request was personal. The girl with emerald hair spat in frustration. She mumbled that Issei truly did not understand a woman's heart. Issei agreed sarcastically that it was his greatest flaw. Rayquaza finally admitted that she simply wanted to spend time with him and see the outside world. She explained that it had been almost a week since he had captured her and, aside from his house and school, she had hardly had the chance to go anywhere. Mostly she read things from his room or the clubroom, and that no longer satisfied her. She wanted to go out and walk around. Issei asked that nothing prevented her from doing so. He pointed out that she could visit the city or do what she wished when he was not there, and he even offered to give her pocket money if she needed it. She insisted that she wanted to do it with him. Realizing the meaning behind her request, Issei rubbed the back of his neck and admitted he had not spent much time with her in recent days. He promised to ask Rias for a few evenings off from club activities and to notify his clients so they would not request his services during that time. They would spend time together and do whatever she wanted. Rayquaza hid her excitement and agreed. Issei told her to start thinking about what she wanted to do and warned that he had to leave before he was late. She called out until he was gone. He smiled and left. He took his bicycle and rode toward his destination, Miltan's house. She had requested a contract for that evening, and Hyoudou intended to try to fulfill it. Attempt was the key word, because Miltan, born in the wrong body and struggling with gender identity, often had difficulty distinguishing what was possible from what was not. The first time she had asked Issei to make her a magical girl or otherwise grant her supernatural powers, she had even dressed to match the request, and the memory made him cringe. That request, of course, could not be completed. Despite her many impossible requests, Miltan had occasionally asked for things within his reach. After Issei had shown her the boosted gear, she had become obsessed with watching magical girl anime, and somehow that had led to a contract that he could fulfill with relative ease compared to her other demands. This time, however, he had an idea that might put an end to Miltan's impossible requests for good. While pedaling, Issei thought again about his conversation with Rayquaza. He recognized that he had not been present for her since the day he captured her. Unlike Rainer or Asia, this Momon came from an entirely different dimension. It made sense that she would be shy and hesitant to explore the outside world without him, who had been the reason for her presence. She was his responsibility, and he intended to honor that responsibility. Still, he had the vague sense that something lay just out of his awareness, as if there was a fact he should know but that it slipped past him completely. Issei tried to convince himself that he was only imagining it. Rayquaza was a strong, independent woman. In her Pokemon form she had been even more powerful than him. If she had not limited herself to her Momon form at the start of their fight, she would have won before Hyoudou could do anything. And by the time the pawn had transformed the boosted gear into a subspecies, it had already been too late. His own overconfidence had cost him the victory. He also considered the possibility that Rayquaza had intended to be captured all along. His mother had mentioned that Rayquaza had rushed to answer Arceus and Shikigami's call because she wanted to see more of the outside world, something she could not freely do in her original dimension, where Delta had restricted her to only 2 places. Now that he thought about it, Issei realized that nothing seemed to have changed much since he had taken her in. She still limited herself to 2 places, seemingly by choice. No wonder she was so irritable and impatient on the subject. He would feel the same in her position. At least she seemed to get along with Asia and Rainer. That observation made Hyoudou frown slightly. The relationship between the newcomer and the other 2 was hard to define. The Momon and the Fallen One were not exactly friends, but neither were they hostile. There was no palpable tension. They were more than acquaintances but not quite friends, an uneasy tolerance, a rivalrous familiarity without outright competition. Asia's gentle, naive nature meant that Rainer and Rayquaza's relationship had not developed into something involving her. The Momon genuinely seemed to like Asia a lot. When the 3 of them were together there was nothing malicious in the air, and the pawn was grateful for that. His mother remained uneasy about having young women staying in the household. Issei did not blame her. If he had not been reincarnated and learned to control himself, he would never have considered such an arrangement either. He could not simply tell his mother that the problem he had once suffered had miraculously disappeared, so he let her remain unaware and accepted Rias's explanation that the 3 girls living with them were helping him recover. For now, despite Hyoudou's mother's heightened vigilance, the lie held. It was undeniable that her son behaved better in their presence, even if the reason for that change was not what his mother imagined. As for the Gremory herself, the pawn could not say exactly what was happening with his king, but Rias had been growing more distant lately, not in attitude, but distracted. Since recruiting Asia, the king had developed a look Issei had trouble defining, a mix of apprehension and something else he did not recognize. The club members had noticed, though no one had spoken up. Aquino had quietly stepped in to support Rias whenever she seemed inattentive to those around her. Today was one of those days. Rias's distraction led to small, regular mistakes about minor matters. They were not severe, and Himajima's discreet interventions had prevented larger problems, but it had reached the point where even Asia, who was not the most observant in their group, was beginning to notice. Kaneko and Hyoudou saw it too but said nothing. They likely knew more than Issei did, having been reincarnated longer than he had. If they thought nothing could be done for Rias, he would trust them for now. Perhaps it was only a rough patch and things would settle after a few days. In any case, Akino had taken on some of the king's workload so Rias could have time alone to sort through whatever troubled her. For that reason, Issei decided to visit his client from home today instead of leaving from school as he usually did when he had club activities. It made his commute slightly easier, even if only by a little. Lost in thought, his bike ride to the client's house went quickly. After securing his bicycle, the pawn walked up to the entrance. Standing on the threshold, Issei took a deep breath for courage and knocked. Although he had come to know Miltan after several summons and had grown to appreciate her unusual personality, he still never fully got used to being in her presence. The first seconds were always the hardest, and he felt some relief as familiarity eased the awkwardness. Issei considered it unprofessional to show discomfort in front of a client. He silently congratulated himself on his self-control when the door opened to reveal Miltan's massive, muscular frame and exuberant smile. He reminded himself that her appearance did not reflect the kindness in her heart. Issei thought he might introduce Miltan to Asia someday, certain the two would get along. That was something to consider later. Miltan greeted him with an overly cheerful, sincere welcome, clearly delighted that he had come. Issei returned her smile and reminded himself that her mixture of constant wonder and resolute optimism was touching. He then asked what she needed this time. Miltan begged for amazing powers for herself, making the same impossible request she had made the first time they met. The first time, not knowing the personality of the woman who had been born male, Issei Hyoudou had mistaken the intensity of her request for murderous intent. Now that he knew her better, he recognized how absurd his earlier misunderstanding had been. It had been the depth of her faith in him and his abilities, a faith that had not faltered even after he had shown he could not grant her wish. Issei acknowledged that the request might be impossible but agreed to try, still smiling. Miltan responded with genuine surprise and overwhelming joy, tears in her eyes as she said she had waited so long for this moment. Issei suggested they not delay. Miltan led the reincarnated demon into her home and directed him into the living room where contracts were always performed. Issei was familiar with the room lined with magical girl figurines and posters. His first intimidation had passed, and he understood that Miltan had once been in a situation similar to his before his reincarnation. That understanding strengthened his resolve to help her. Issei sat across from her and looked her in the eyes. He reminded her one last time that what he was about to attempt was experimental and might not work, promising to seek another method if it failed and that, if it succeeded, her wish would be granted. Miltan confirmed she was ready. Issei took a deep breath and announced his promotion to bishop. Magical power surged through him like a tide, a heady sensation for someone who had only recently gained a much larger reservoir of magic. He forced himself to focus entirely on the task to avoid mistakes. He activated Dragon Booster and Boost. The magical power reached unprecedented levels that he could hardly comprehend, far beyond anything he had known. His knowledge of mystical arts had been shallow before and most spells had been out of reach until his recent double contract with Yui and Ritsu. It had been only days since then, and he was still adjusting to the dramatic increase in his reserves. He could sense that he was now, in terms of raw magical strength, far more powerful than Rias and Akino. Suddenly Issei realized he had pushed himself past his limits. He reset the boosted gear, and the excess magic dispersed instantly, leaving only the effect of his promotion. Had he not acted, his body might have reacted catastrophically. The brief strain left him breathing hard on the couch, drenched in sweat and collapsed with exhaustion. His muscles trembled and spasmed painfully, and it took all his willpower not to cry out in front of his client. Milton noticed and, genuinely alarmed, asked if he was all right. Issei managed to say he was fine and explained that he had simply miscalculated. Miltan suggested they stop for the day so he could recover, not wanting him to be harmed trying to fulfill her wish. Issei reassured her that it was unnecessary and that he had overestimated himself but would not repeat the mistake. Miltan offered to wait a few days for him to recuperate, but Issei insisted he could continue after taking a few moments to steady himself. He closed his eyes, focused on his breathing, and felt his body stop trembling. He announced that he was ready to resume. Drake, who had been silent until then, warned him to be more careful and reminded him that Issei had been lucky Drake had reacted quickly before and could not guarantee the same again. Issei promised his partner and host that there would be no need for such luck a second time, having learned to be exceedingly cautious. It was for that reason that he decided to change his approach. Instead of rushing, he would proceed step by step. That way he could check each stage and make sure he would not risk an overload of magic. He activated Dragon Drive and then Boost, planning a careful progression. His previous mistake could be excused. It was not entirely his fault. It was a detail that had escaped him simply because it had never presented itself to Issei before today. Until now, Hyoudou had focused exclusively on the physical aspect of his body when testing the boosted gear. While there was a cause and effect relationship between the body and magic, the two aspects were not mutually dependent. A strong, well-trained body could to some extent accommodate a larger amount of magic, but the effect was ultimately limited. In the case of the boosted gear, even if Issei could withstand having his physical abilities boosted 10 times over, the same did not apply to his magical capabilities. His body was solid from countless hours of training before and after his reincarnation, and he had even used his sacred gear during those sessions to push his physical limits further. His magic, however, was weak. He had been born without a natural talent for it. At the moment, it was little more than a seed beginning to sprout. Because of that, Hyoudou could not use the boosted gear to raise his magic to the same level as his body. It made sense. His magic was like an untrained muscle and could not endure the same intensity as his physically hardened body, which had been continuously pushed and strengthened for years. Issei had to first understand where his magical limits lay. Since magic was an aspect of himself he had never exploited, he needed to advance in small steps to avoid a repeat of the earlier near accident. Speaking of limits, the pawn had finally found his for magic, 4 boosts. It was little, especially compared to the 10 he could stack physically. Nevertheless, for a first time it seemed reasonable, even respectable. Multiplying his magical abilities by 16 was no small thing for someone who a week earlier had been near 0 in magic units. Hyoudou's recent increase in magical reserves likely contributed as well. Issei murmured that he was ready, both to himself and to his client. Miltan said that she was ready, her earlier worry giving way to growing excitement. Issei ordered her to give him her hand. Without hesitation, the woman who had been born male obeyed. The pawn took the offered hand with his left hand, which was covered by the boosted gear. He activated transfer. All the accumulated magical power flowed out of Hyoudou's body into Miltan's. She kept her eyes closed and wore a look of concentration as if in silent prayer. When the transfer finished, she opened her eyes cautiously, blinking several times with a mixture of confusion, expectation, and hope. She stared at Issei for several seconds until an instinctive understanding dawned on her face. Something had changed, something more was inside her now. Miltan asked, trembling from excitement, whether it had worked. The pawn simply smiled and suggested that she try and see for herself. It should not have been that simple. Magic could not generally be used just by hoping it would work, though strong will did play a part in casting a spell. Still, Hyoudou was reasonably sure his client knew how to handle newly granted magic. She had told him at their first meeting that she had tried everything to acquire the powers that would make her a magical girl. From meditation to rituals and dimension travel attempts, she had tried and failed to achieve results. The reason was cruelly simple: her raw magic talent was even more abysmal than Issei's. Before his reincarnation, the pawn had 1 or 2 points of magical energy, a laughably small positive amount. Miltan did not even have that. Her magical reserves had been exactly 0. No wonder her efforts had always been in vain. Where practice had been impossible, Miltan had compensated with a deep theoretical knowledge. Her understanding was likely biased by her desire to become a magical girl, but the underlying substance seemed coherent enough. If she had only adapted existing knowledge to her goal and not invented anything, it should work. They would soon find out. Stood in the center of the living room with her eyes closed and remained motionless for several seconds. She announced that she would transform and then raised a wand into the air. It looked like a homemade pink plastic toy, the sort of object found in any toy store. When nothing seemed to happen at first, Issei thought the attempt had failed. Then Miltan began to glow. Stars and lights of many colors shimmered and swirled around her in a slightly psychedelic display. And then the unexpected occurred. Miltan began to shrink. At first the pawn suspected an optical illusion, but it was real. Her stature, originally well over 2 meters tall, diminished in size and volume. The large, sculpted muscles that had once given her the appearance of a champion bodybuilder gradually receded. Her arms and legs grew slender and delicate. The imposing masculine presence gave way to the slender, refined silhouette of a young woman slightly shorter than Issei. Never before had the outfit she usually wore seemed so perfectly suited to its wearer. In that moment, a magical girl was born. Miltan proclaimed that she was magical Miltan and struck a pose, spinning around and adopting a classic magical hero stance. As he looked, Issei could not help but notice that Miltan's chest had changed noticeably, stretching the top of her outfit. He stared, unsure whether to be surprised or uneasy at the unexpected physical change. He offered a hesitant congratulation. Miltan bowed deeply and thanked him, clearly thrilled by the new magical abilities she had been given. She claimed that, thanks to him, she had finally become a true magical girl. Issei, distracted for a moment by the sight, quickly regained his composure and reminded her that he had fulfilled her wish because it was part of their contract. Then his expression grew more serious as he delivered unwelcome news. The powers she had were only temporary. Miltan reacted with shock and confusion, tears forming as she asked what she should do. Issei explained that the magic he had given her was not her own. He had transferred part of his own magical energy to her, and inevitably that energy would be depleted, leaving her unable to transform again until she was replenished. She asked timidly if he would help her again. Issei confirmed that he would, as long as they signed another contract. He advised her to enjoy the magic while she had it and to summon him again when it ran out for a recharge. He added that, over time and with repeated transfers, her body might be able to tolerate more magical energy and perhaps eventually produce its own. Relieved, Miltan embraced him in gratitude. Issei felt the sudden force of the hug and registered momentary discomfort from the pressure, but he accepted it as a sincere display of thanks. When she finally let go, Miltan asked how long the powers would last. Issei admitted it was hard to say. Since this was the first attempt, he could only estimate that the effects would likely last a few hours, though it could be less depending on how she used the energy. He then explained the mechanics and risks. The amount of magic he had transferred was roughly twice that of an ordinary low-ranking demon's reserve. For a human, that was a respectable amount, but because it was not her own magic and she lacked an internal magical core or receptacle, her body could only hold the power by force. Fortunately, because the energy was demonic in nature and demons store magic directly in their bodies, the transfer did not cause immediate rejection or complications. Issei admitted that his main concern had been the possibility of a magical rejection. If a body tried to contain more magic than it could handle, the excess could forcefully expel itself. In extreme cases, this could result in a catastrophic failure of the host, a dangerous outcome he wanted to avoid. Fortunately, the quantity he had transferred to Miltan was not so great that such a disaster was likely. Her unusually sturdy constitution should permit her to tolerate a comparable amount of magical energy, so the transfer was relatively safe because unknown factors could still influence the result, and one important variable was that Miltan was human, not demonic. Still, because the magic was not native to her, some leakage was inevitable. A human without a proper magical core or artifact could not perfectly retain external energy, and the transformation itself consumed a considerable amount of power. As a result, a small stream of magical energy would escape from Miltan continually, shortening the effective time she could remain empowered. Issei had already considered these factors and their implications for any future transfers. Miltan, despite all her goodwill, simply had no natural aptitude for magic, as shown by her complete absence of magical energy. At first, Issei Hyoudou had considered using the boosted gear to stimulate her magical growth, but he quickly understood it would be pointless. The multiplier of his sacred gear could not change the fact that 0 multiplied by anything was still 0. That approach was therefore not possible for now. Later, however, it might become feasible. The pawn was reasonably confident that by repeatedly transferring his own magic into Miltan's body, her system would eventually recognize the energy as beneficial and begin to produce it itself. Once that happened, the magical girl would be magically autonomous, and it would then be possible to increase her reserves with the boosted gear. For the moment, though, it was a distant hope. Issei cancelled his promotion to bishop and returned to being a pawn, then told Miltan that now the contract had been fulfilled, it was time to validate it, and asked if she was ready. Miltan nodded enthusiastically in reply. The boost activated. Issei was stunned as he received the reward. His magical power had jumped from 83 to 179 points, a little more than double his previous level. Quick mental calculation told him he had gained 96 units of magical energy through 5 successive boosts, meaning Miltan's contract had initially provided a power increase equivalent to 3 ordinary contracts, which was exceptional. That was undeniable proof of the magical girl's satisfaction, even though the contract had only been a partial success enough to validate it, but not enough to make the wish permanent. He wondered how many magic points he might gain from a full success next time, though it was a curiosity rather than a pressing concern. He could always use the boosted gear to cheat. He again felt the slight tug in his body as his reserves expanded suddenly. As before, it would probably take a few days, perhaps less, for his body to adjust to the change. Issei said it was time for him to leave and headed for the door with Miltan. He instructed her to take notes on how she used her magic, especially how long it took before she exhausted it, so they could track progress in future sessions. Miltan cheerfully promised to do so and said she would see him next time. Issei then left her home. Once outside, he let out a long sigh. It had been taxing. He had expected some difficulty, but not for the reasons he first imagined. Miltan's appearance after transformation had left him awkward. Her transformed look was striking, and he had to remind himself to remain professional and keep his instincts under control. He was still uncertain whether his client was a woman in a male body or simply a woman with unusual hormonal traits, and contemplating that only gave him a headache. To distract himself, he took his phone to let his contact Rayquaza know he would be returning soon and noticed a message from his king, Rias, asking him to stop by the club before going home because it was important. The message did not seem urgent enough to require a call, but since he was finished, he decided to go. He grabbed his bicycle, raised his arm, and invoked his magic to teleport. Now that he had enough power for the spell, there was no reason not to use it. He had avoided teleportation for client visits before, partly because his clients enjoyed the novelty of a demon arriving by bike, but tonight he was ready to use the shortcut. The teleportation brought him directly into the occult research club room. Rias expressed relief and said she was glad he had come so quickly, and she then noted that his magical growth had continued to progress. Issei replied that it would be foolish not to take advantage of the situation and then turned his attention to the other person in the room. He greeted the student council president known as Shirtorai. Sona Citri responded with a brief nod and explained that she, like Rias, was a demon and served as a king. The members of the student council were her domain. She clarified that her real name was Sona Citri and that the Shirtorai alias was used to conceal her identity while operating in the human world. Issei greeted her. Politely, not particularly surprised. He recalled a conversation with Tsubasa a few weeks earlier in which she had mentioned her role in the council. He guessed that their presence was the reason he had been asked to come. Sona confirmed that he was correct and that it had indeed been at her request that Rias had asked him to come that evening. Sona Citri, the student council president, informed Issei Hyoudou that she had been made aware of a recent overstep of his authority as a pawn of Rias and that she required an explanation. Issei repeated in confusion that he had no idea what she meant and apologized, addressing her respectfully. Sona allowed a faint frown and said she would provide context so he could understand the situation, then asked if he agreed. Issei confirmed that he did. Sona explained that, as both a high-class devil and a king of her peerage, she and Rias Gremory divided the territory of Kuo between their peerages. To avoid conflict over clients, rules had been established to allocate contracts. The student council peerage was assigned contracts for all students, school staff, and their families, while Rias's occult research club peerage took responsibility for the rest of the city. The distribution might seem uneven at first glance, but the balance between the two was actually reasonable. Hearing this, Issei began to understand the issue. Sona continued that they faced an awkward situation in which a member of Rias's peerage had technically encroached on her administrative domain without either of them knowing how it had happened. She asked Issei to clarify how Keita's Yui and Murayama Ritsu had come into possession of Gremory summoning leaflets. Issei admitted he genuinely had no idea and rubbed the back of his head. He related that Yui and Ritsu had apparently found the leaflets in their club locker room and that their summoning of him had been accidental. Sona listened, furrowing her brow. She noted that there was no reason for 2 Gremory leaflets to be in the Kendo club locker room. No member of Rias's peerage was enrolled there, and since the girls were students, they would normally have received Citri leaflets instead. Furthermore, Sona had checked and the houses of Keita's and Murayama had not had sufficient summoning potential until very recently, and by that time they were already under contract with Issei. When Issei hesitated, he admitted that part of the situation might be his fault. He explained that a change had occurred around the time he had told the girls he planned to stop visiting the club. He then described the circumstances surrounding his summoning to both kings. Sona accepted that explanation as a plausible reason for a portion of the responsibility and acknowledged it as a good-faith accident. Since Issei had not known, he was not at fault. She added that if a similar scenario occurred in the future, she expected him to decline the contract and report the situation so she could handle it administratively. Issei agreed and then asked about the consequences for Yui and Ritsu. Sona sighed and said that given the circumstances, an exception could be made. It had been their first summoning, and since they were already contracted to Issei and expected him to respond when called, interfering now would only complicate matters. She did not want to explain to the girls that their contracts had been reassigned, especially since they clearly liked Issei. Sona warned Issei not to take advantage of the exception and made it clear that she did not usually compromise. Issei promised to prevent any recurrence and bowed slightly. Sona accepted the assurance with a curt nod and excused herself, stating she had much work to finish and still needed to investigate how Keita's and Murayama had obtained the wrong leaflets. Rias acknowledged her departure with a nod, and Sona offered a brief, formal farewell to Issei before leaving the occult research clubroom. After Sona's departure, Issei watched her go, thoughtful. The conversation had been illuminating. In particular, the mystery of why Yui and Ritsu had not received leaflets became clearer. The problem could likely be resolved by adjusting the summoning detector to include the girls' homes or by handing the proper leaflets to them in person at school. Rias commented that the exchange had been interesting, and Issei agreed, a little distracted. Rias observed that it was fortunate Sona did not spend much time around him, explaining that if she did, she would notice his unusual development in magic and likely become jealous. Issei acknowledged he could imagine such a reaction and found himself more focused on Rias. He was glad to see her cheerful and carefree. The strain that had weighed on her in recent days seemed to have passed, and she had returned to herself. Unknown to Issei, however, the calm would not last. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and Rias's worry would soon return despite the brief moment of relief.